The Astartes are out in force today with their full index rules revealed for Warhammer 40k. Let's talk stratagems, armories, datasheets, and unit abilities with a review of the entire Space Marine army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're breaking down Index Space Marines, looking through the entire massive rules document, one rule at a time. Games Workshop have certainly teased the Space Marine players with quite a lot of datasheets so far. Really cool to see the entire option list available, and particularly some funky datasheet abilities and the exact wording on some stratagems that helps us get a pretty decent idea for how the army is going to be operating on the table. Before we get into it, this video is going to be in two parts. The Space Marine Index is massive. This first bigger part is going to be about all the generic choices that you can play regardless of chapter, and then part 2, which might drop in a day or two depending on when I have time. In part 2 we'll move on to all the chapter locks choices. In this document we've got all the options for the more codex chapters, things like Ultramarines, Salamanders and Imperial Fifths, but not the divergent chapters like Blood Angels and Dark Angels. In terms of what else is and isn't here though, this is Index Space Marines. We've got the faction rules here for Oath of Moment and some chapter restrictions depending on how you can take certain special characters. The Gladius Task Force as the Space Marine launch detachment. This one's got its Combat Doctrines detachment rule, 6 stratagems and 4 enhancements, and then an absolutely spectacular amount of datasheets, over 120 of them in total. And there have been a fair few shifts around with these ones. A few of the datasheets are consolidated or gone. There are a fair few extra ones for the Leviathan box set, plus a few others created from models that we already had. And as mentioned, it does include the Codex chapter characters, such as Rebute, Gilliman and friends, which we'll cover in the next video. As with the other indexes, we're still waiting on points currently. Apparently they should come sometime next week. And we also don't have the Combat Patrol rules yet. Again, they're going to be coming out en masse in their own document apparently. Getting into the army rules though, and first up we have Oath of Moment. This one's the big Space Marine rule that all Adeptus Astartes get, including things like Blood Angels and Death Watch and Space Wolves and friends. This one's present on just about every datasheet. The way that it works is that you nominate one unit for 4 rerolls against them in the command phase. Basically pick the biggest, scariest, hardest to kill thing in your opponent's army, and make your Space Marines ridiculously good at killing it. Just about everything in the army has the rule. You get to reroll all hit rolls and wound rolls against your chosen target, so it's a spectacularly massive damage buff, often getting easily around double damage output from certain weapon systems, and even if it's not hitting those heady heights, it's still generally very strong indeed. It's a bit of a weird rule in that it interacts strangely with some keywords. For example, it's really nice with Devastating Wounds, where you can fish for more wounds of 6s, quite nice with lethal hits as well, for fishing for those 6s, but then a bit less awesome on twin linked weapons, which already get full wound rerolls baked into their datasheet. Gilliman has a bit of a way of interacting with it by nominating a second oath target if you slay the first one, quite big for him, and in general I do feel like it's a bit of a swingy rule, going to be a whole load better against certain armies with big tough units, less good at more hiding spec ops type armies with a bunch of small units running around, and it does seem really quite a lot more powerful in smaller games as well. In Incursion, any unit that you nominate is going to be a massive chunk of your opponent's army, but it's going to be a bit less so at say 3000 point Onslaught. Certainly a massively powerful faction rule though, just huge amounts of extra damage output that your opponent can't do much about. The other primary Space Marine rule is a rule that prevents mixing chapters. Unlike most armies, Space Marines have 2 faction keywords on a bunch of units, things like special characters like Adrax Agatone or the Ultramarines Victrix Guard. The way that this one works is that you need to just select some special characters or unique units from just one chapter. You can't mix and match within the army, like say taking Sanguinary Guard alongside Gilliman. So basically your army is only going to have one choice of the special characters it's using and bringing along, whether it's going to be ones from Imperial Fists or ones from Raven Guard or whatever. The Gladius Task Force doesn't appear to have any other additional restrictions on that. At least from these rules, it does look like there's nothing to stop the divergent chapters using that and taking their unique units, unless they happen to have something that stops them in their own indexes, but it looks like they're good to use the standard battle company. Talking of the Gladius Task Force though, it does seem like really quite a solid Space Marine launch detachment, good things for both shooting and melee armies, and a mix of the two. Its rule is the Combat Doctrines, rather than just being flat extra AP buffs like it is currently, it's now more of a movement buff, and you choose Devastator Tactical or Assault Doctrine each turn. It's not locked to any certain order. You can choose each of these doctrines exactly once, you can't choose them more than once. You select them in the command phase, and then depending on whether you've chosen Devastator Tactical or Assault, you get to either advance and shoot with your entire army, you get to fall back and shoot and charge with your entire army, or you get to advance and charge with your entire army in Assault Doctrine. I feel like both the advance and deal damage options are very nice, that's just flat extra movement buffs there. Advance and shoot is really quite nice for close range units, things like aggressors, or just getting a bunch of units line of sight early in the game. I'd say advance and charge is probably the most powerful. Making melee or not making melee can be a really big deal, and that's going to be a massive advantage on getting the jump on your opponent that way. Tactical Doctrine just feels a little bit more situational. You could just trigger it if neither of the other ones is going to have a huge impact this turn, and particularly if you've got a unit that's locked in combat with the enemy and really wants to fall back, shoot and charge something else. They're all very good though, and perhaps one of the most useful things is that there's a squad tactics stratagem which allows you to flip a unit into any one of them, so you've always got these rules on tap when you really need them. I quite like the design as well, that each of them also has their unique stratagem that boosts that certain doctrine. That does feel like quite a well designed system. I think it's a solid detachment rule. Space Marines certainly have the damage between Oath of Moment and their datasheets. This one will help them get it where it needs to be. Moving on to stratagems, and we've got 6 of them here. First up is the Assault Doctrine focus one, which is called Honour the Chapter. Melee weapons in your charging units get the Lance keyword, a +1 to wound on the charge, and if you happen to be an Assault Doctrine as well, they get an extra pip of AP as well. +1 to wound is pretty massive, very nice for one command point, definitely could be worth it against a whole bunch of targets that, and between that and the AP in the Assault Doctrine could easily be a +50% damage boost or more, really not too bad given that Space Marine Assault units can be fairly savage. For one command point, we've got Armour of Contempt. This one worsens AP by 1 in the shooting or fight phase, basically giving your unit a bit more durability. Space Marines tend to have pretty good armor saves, and this is perhaps particularly nice with anything with a 2+ save against AP-1 or AP-2. Perhaps worth weighing it up against Go to Ground, which could also give you an invul save as well at range. Sometimes that might be flat superior, but quite nice that you can use this in melee as well, and again really quite nice to be able to have some durability on demand. Squad Tactics is a stratagem for infantry or mounted units. They get to move d6 inches at the end of the enemy movement phase if the enemy finished a move within 9 inches of them. If you happen to be in the Tactical Doctrine, that's moved to a flat 6 inches, so nice and predictable and will guarantee you getting you where you need to go. Movement shenanigans in the enemy turn can be massively disruptive, means that you could just throw your unit all onto an objective and put loads more objective control points there. You could hide the unit out of line of sight, or you could backpedal frantically from an oncoming enemy assault and just get out of the way of their charge. Seems absolutely massive if it could give you a big swing and keep a unit safe that's just about to die from an enemy charge. That might be one of the best uses of it. Next up, we've got the Devastator flavoured one called Storm of Fire. This one gives your unit ignores cover when they're shooting, and also if you're in Devastator Doctrine, gives you an extra pip of AP as well. I feel like the extra pip of AP is actually more reliably good. That applies whether or not the opponent's in cover, so I think this is going to be a lot more usable in Devastator, and of course if you can get both of those effects off at the same time, then an extra 2 AP is well worth 1 CP. Seems solid enough, perhaps most effects on fairly low AP units. 10th edition does tend to have a fair bit less AP going round, and sometimes you just need a little bit of extra firepower to clear a tough enemy unit. For 2 command points, we've got a slightly pricier one called Only in Death. This one's Fights in Death for an Adeptus Astartes unit, but you do have to declare it when the unit's attacked, not actually when it dies. You'd have to be pretty certain that the enemy unit is going to wipe out yours, otherwise you'd literally just be spending 2 command points for basically no reason. Quite a nice trick to have in the bag though, even if it is particularly pricey. Again, as with guaranteeing a charge or denying it, the difference between having a whole unit fighting close combat or none of it fighting is huge, and this is one way to guarantee that you do fight one way or another. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Adaptive Strategy. This is the one that allows your units to just flex into any doctrine that you want. Pop up Assault Doctrine, Tactical Doctrine, or Devastator Doctrine, so basically any unit can advance and charge if they want to, fall back and shoot and charge, or advance and shoot. A lot of the time, again, this is going to make the difference between a unit actually being able to inflict damage this turn and not doing so, or potentially it could be the difference between a unit having to advance onto an objective and choosing whether or not to score some victory points this turn or give up their shooting completely. I think this is very nice to have all the combat doctrines on offer here, even if you want to use a different one this turn, and I feel like this one just as a utility stratagem is going to get used a whole lot. Overall, I feel like it's a really solid set of stratagems, lots of ones that you could basically just plug away with CP into and spend all game long. It's going to be interesting to weigh up which of these tend to be the best. I say just for reliable value, Honour the Chapter seems great for +1 to wound, Adaptive Strategy for the movement every time it matters, and I'd probably say the rest of them are good but situational. In the right units damaging or attacking each other, they could be absolutely massive, or with a very crafty bit of positioning from squad tactics if you can see something clever to do, like say either hiding your units or using it to stop yourself getting charged. I think Space Marine players are going to be kind of spoilt for choice between these and the generic ones. It's going to be tempting to plug damage into Overwatch as well. Finally, for the main Gladius Task Force rules, we've got 4 enhancements. Here are the first 2 in the Honor Vehement and the Artificer Armor. The Honor upgrade gives you +1 strength and +1 attack, or +2 strength and attacks if you're in the Assault Doctrine. Certainly a solid damage boost, and if you just want a fighty character, this is the one that you go for. I feel like in 10th edition most characters don't tend to be absolute beatsticks, more adding things to their squad and chipping in some solid but not overwhelming damage themselves, but it could be quite good on certain characters. Maybe say the Primaris Captain, who can go up to 9 attacks for a turn. This could put him all the way up to 11 and +2 strength to boot. Or maybe things like the Judas here, who gets a whole bunch of attacks with devastating wounds and the precision keyword, so this could be quite nice for assassinating enemy leaders. The Artificer Armor gives you a 2+ save and a 5+ feel no pain. Solid extra durability there. The feel no pain is an extra 50% just by itself, and the 2+ save is going to be great, particularly for anything that doesn't have an invul. I think it's nice as a defensive buff, maybe good for something that's already kind of tough and hard to remove, like a Gravis Captain maybe. I feel like a lot of characters really are just going to be relying on their bodyguards to stay alive though. I'm not entirely convinced that this one's going to save a librarian's life if he's out in the open and getting shot by half the enemy army. Then the other 2 that we've got are a couple of buffing ones. Bolter Discipline I think looks excellent. Sustained hits 1 at range for the bearer's unit that they're leading, and it doesn't have to be bolters. Usually if the bearer's unit hits on a 3+, that's effectively a 25% range damage boost. Very, very nice to have on top of whatever other buffs the leader is doing for the unit. And as a nice extra on top of that, if you're in Devastator Doctrine as well, a hit roll of 5+ scores a critical hit. That's excellent for the Bolter Discipline buff, but also could trigger other buffs like lethal hits if say it's a lieutenant with this leadership trait. Seems great unless this trait is extortionately expensive, it looks like a really good one. Finally, we've got Adept of the Codex. This one's captain only, so is a bit more restricted than the others. It's basically a once per game activation of the Tactical Doctrine. Fall back, shoot and charge if you want to, can sometimes be handy for a couple of other things, say like the boosted version of that 6-inch move stratagem. I feel like as the Tactical Doctrine trait is just a little bit more of a situational one that just might not really come up every single game unless you're locked down. I feel like it's perhaps not the strongest enhancement this one. It might just be a bit better to go for this one via a stratagem if you need it, and otherwise spend your points on something that's a bit more direct damage dealing. Out of enhancements, I feel like the Bolter Discipline one seems by far the best. Certainly might cost the most points compared with the rest, but that one just adds a colossal amount of value rather than just a little bit of extra damage, defense, or a once per game fallback and attack. I'd probably rate Adept of the Codex as a good second place one though. Could be nice enough with a captain leading a big block of Terminators or similar. Moving along though, and next up we have the core of the index in the mighty collection of datasheets. As with the Tyranids Codex, they have had a properly good look at these. A lot of things are gone that used to be there. There are a fair few new datasheets, both in terms of old models with reimagined splitting of datasheets and things like that, plus the new units from Leviathan. And also battlefield roles have changed, so things are a little bit more nebulous perhaps, a little bit more easy to classify with keywords like Dreadnoughts and things. For battle line units for the Codex, it looks like all the Intercessors and Tactical Marines as well. Tactical Marines weirdly weren't listed in the battle line section of the Space Marine web store, but it looks like they were just missed off. It does seem that the Phobos classifications were accurate though. Neither Incursors nor Infiltrators are battle line, so you can't really spam those, not that a whole load of people did more than about 3 units otherwise. For holding down objectives as well, Tactical Marines have seen a bit of a nerf in having to take 10-man units, which I think is definitely going to hurt them. Otherwise, for datasheets added in, we've got extra datasheets from the Leviathan box, things like the Ballistas Dreadnought, and the Space Marine Lieutenant with the combi weapon. Quite cool to see the Primaris Company Champion appear here. He has finally been rolled into the main codex despite being a limited edition miniature up to now. The Scouts have had their datasheet split. You've now got Scout Snipers as well as regular Scouts, depending on which kit you pick up. Command squads have rolled in the firstborn unique characters, so things like the Apothecary, the Company Champion, and the Ancient. All of that lot are just part of one squad now, as opposed to independent characters that move around or join firstborn units. The Primaris ones are all separate though, and they can join different units, probably just mainly because they're sold separately. Otherwise, they've also split up jump pack and non-jump pack units for various characters that had them as an option on their datasheet. The Vanguard Veterans and the Assault Marines, they're now different datasheets depending on whether or not you take those jumpy options. Otherwise, for datasheets that have either been consolidated into one or just removed outright, it's these ones. The firstborn characters that have been rolled into the command squad have basically been removed as their own independent units. You have to field them together now. The venerable Dreadnought appears to have gone, interestingly enough. Kind of surprising that it was that datasheet that bit the dust rather than the standard Dreadnought. They still sell the venerable one, but not the regular Dreadnought. I guess whichever mini boxy Dreadnought you have though, it's just represented by the standard Space Marine Dreadnought datasheet, as opposed to anything hitting on a 2+. The heavy bolt rifle captain has been rolled into the main datasheet. That's just an option for the Gravis captain, as I think it kind of should have been to start with really. And perhaps the biggest outright loss of a unit is the veteran intercessors, which just seem to be removed entirely. They never really had their own kits and were just a different way that you could field intercessors. I guess maybe the need for them has just been taken down a bit, seeing as Games Workshop have released those Stern Guard veterans, which you could field fancy intercessors as them with their bolt rifles anyway. Finally, for datasheet things, it looks like combat squads across the board seem to be gone. No more splitting your Space Marine units down in half when you start the game. That will lose a bit of flexibility for certain units. It was a rule that was used occasionally, and it's perhaps particularly painful for a tactical squad that needs to be fielded in tens. Otherwise, I'm actually kind of pleasantly surprised to see that a whole bunch of the range rotated stuff is here. Say, for example, Sergeant Kronos when we go for the Space Marine Special Characters video. I certainly was half expecting the range rotated stuff just to disappear, as Yarrick did for the Guard. I would bear in mind though that them being here doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to be in the upcoming Space Marine Codex, and that drops in a few months. Before we start with the datasheet proper, there is an Armoury card in the Space Marine Codex. I think it's just due to the sheer amount of options that a bunch of sergeants and things have. A lot of these are recorded as options that certain units can take, but they're just not listed on every datasheet for brevity. If you've been following along with the 10th edition reveals, most of these aren't exactly surprises. Combi weapons have been consolidated into just one basic all-around profile, anti-infantry 4+ with devastating wounds, and are basically a bolter besides that. A bit sad to lose things like combi melters and combi plasma as different options for frying certain elites. Multi-melters are shorter range at 18 inches, which I think is very relevant for the Space Marines. Plasma weapons pick up the new hazardous keyword, just the one roll to see if they die, no multi-rolls now. And perhaps the most interesting reveal that I hadn't seen previewed very much were the grav weapons. Looks like the grav cannon is 24-inch range, 3 shots, strength 6 at AP-1 and damage 3. Definitely lacking a lot more AP now, but surprisingly enough it gets the anti-vehicle keyword on a 2+ there. Massively better against armor than other things, it'll still be pretty solid against medium infantry with that AP1 damage 3 profile. Let's get into the units proper though, and first up we'll start with the battle line units with the standard Intercessor squad. Standard Space Marine stat lines haven't really changed all that much. These guys are still very general purpose, anti-infantry, ranged and melee. The bolt rifle's quite a fun profile I think. Lost a bit of range at 24 inches, but it still gets 2 shots even if you move about, both at strength 4, AP1 and damage 1. I've consolidated the various profiles now so you don't have stalkers and auto ones. Maybe not the worst considering there were very minor modelling differences anyway, and I've just lumped all the keywords together. These are both assault and heavy. They hit on a 2+ if you're stationary, and you get to advance and shoot them if you're moving around. As it goes, I feel like they're a fairly solid small arm. The sergeant options have broadly stayed the same. You can see the new profiles for Power Fists and Thunderhammers here. Thunderhammers only hit on a 4+ but get devastating wounds on 6s to compensate them, and they're perhaps a little bit more balanced against the power weapons. The Intercessor special rule is the objective secured rule. This basically gives them sticky objectives, so even if you fail battle shock or you move away from the objective, it still remains yours until the opponent can take it. Seems handy, nothing truly outstanding, hopefully fairly cheap skirmisher infantry for the battle line that can put a bit of fire into the enemy infantry and light troops. Assault Intercessors are broadly unchanged in their damage output, 4 attacks with their Astartes chainswords, heavy bolt pistols still 18 inches and AP-1. Shock Assault has been rolled into the Space Marine datasheets as was kind of expecting it would be. Talking of which though, Shock Assault has actually become their datasheet rule. This one now is also focused around objectives, reroll ones to wound in melee, or reroll all wound rolls if their target is on an objective. Really quite a common one that should mean that they're extra good at clearing enemy units taking points. Really not a bad rule to have when you've got a flurry of low strength attacks with at least some AP. The heavy intercessors are first Gravis, and they gain toughness 6, still a little bit higher than the Terminators there, so that'll make them quite safe against heavy bolters and things, wounding them on 5s now. Their bolted rifles basically have the same sort of changes compared with the intercessor ones they had before. They're still assault and heavy, they gain an extra 6-inch range and strength 5 rather than strength 4, but are otherwise pretty similar. They also get the heavy bolter profiles consolidated into one. Most of it's the same as standard heavy bolters with a heavy keyword and sustained hits 1. Looks like the heavy intercessor version of the weapon though also gains the assault keyword as well, so it means that they can be quite rapid moving around and laying down shots. Their special rule is unyielding in the face of the foe. Once a stratagem, now just their generic rule, it gives them +1 to their saves against damage 1 attacks, pretty nice against small arms to keep them pretty much indomitable against those, between that and toughness 6. Finally for the battle line unit we've got the tactical squad. I must admit this new datasheet I think is probably bad news for them, as they're locked to squads of 10 models, they can no longer take a squad of 5 anymore and they can't combat squad. Kind of ironic given that their special rule is called tactical flexibility. The firstborn battle line can still load up with all manner of special and heavy weapons. They have an example of the new profile of the grav gun here with anti-vehicle 2+, but strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2 and 2 shots otherwise. Their regular bolters are just literally 2 shots out to 24 inches, strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Not much good for much besides light infantry. Also a little bit disappointingly is they still have fewer attacks than the Primaris do at base. Their standard close combat weapons just get 2 attacks. I honestly was expecting them to be leveled up to the same level as Primaris or Chaos Space Marines now. I thought the Games Workshop might have dispensed with the extra attack for Primaris, and for some reason these guys being worse than Chaos Marines. Obviously they can still pack a whole bunch of fun gear, might be interesting enough in certain transports like drop pods maybe, and their rule is fall back, shoot and charge if they want to, so I guess that means that's quite nice protection for the unit if they're quite a big investment one with 10 models. At least you're not going to have that firepower ruined by getting them tagged. They basically get tactical doctrine all the time, I guess that goes with their name. Still though, being locked to 10 models I think really is a big disadvantage. Lots of the time people tend to want to run models in units of 5, particularly slightly less high value troops like tactical marines that often want camp objectives in small numbers. Moving on from the battle line, let's talk about Phobos and infiltration type units. First up we have the Primaris Infiltrators, similar stat line to how they were before. These guys however aren't battle line and are only objective control 1 now. They're not going to be quite as good for holding those midfield points as they were with their objectives secured previously. They're still set up in the midfield, it would be weird if they didn't have the Infiltrator rule. And their weapons, their marksman bolt carbines, are basically the same profile as bolters, 2 shots 24 inches, but they do get heavy as well, so if they're static they get +1 to hit. Probably a bit less good than the auto wounds on 6s, that would be the equivalent of lethal hits now that they had before. Otherwise though, they have retained their rather amazing Omni Scramblers that mean that reinforcements can't come in within 12 inches. Very nice to stop them getting charged from reserve, and out of the 2 upgrades the Helix Gauntlet still seems far better than the Comms Array. Comms Array gives you a chance to refund some stratagems, but the Gauntlet gives you a 6+ feel no pain to the whole unit. Very nice if you're about to get hit by damage 2 weapons or something like that. There may be a bit of a side grade on the negate 1 failed save that it was before. Still looks handy, that bubble of denying enemy deep strike is very nice, if they aren't paying too much of a premium for it. Next up we have their dual build option, the Incursor Squad. Again not battle line and objective control 1. Interestingly enough though, these guys are no longer infiltrate, they don't start in the midfield, instead they've gained scouts like the Reavers have now. It's definitely a downgrade for them I think. I feel like infiltrators will be a lot more tempting as a result. Weapons wise, their Oculus Bolt carbines are basically bolter profile again, but get assault and ignores cover. 2 handy keywords there, and does mean that they can move around the board quite quickly while laying down firepower. In melee, their paired combat blades have traded a bit of AP for sustained hits 1, just a little bit better than you might expect for a standard Primaris melee unit. Really though, I think that the good thing about the Incursors these days is they really provide a massive boost to concentrated Space Marine firepower all laying into one unit. After they've shot, you get to pick one unit that they've shot. That unit gets a +1 to hit against it for any other Space Marines targeting it in the shooting phase, often meaning that you go from a 3+ to hit to a 2+, really quite reliable. It really is quite a crazy rule considering that could apply to half your army potentially, laying its firepower into one tough thing. I feel like having at least one copy of the Incursors running around might be quite valuable for that reason. It means that your units can always be +1 to hit against the one target that matters most, at least until they're killed. Otherwise for their wargear options, the Haywire Mine is now a single attack at within 3 inches. On a 2+ you get D3 mortal wounds, or 2d3 for a vehicle target. Quite nice as you can deploy that at the start of any phase, including when the opponent charges you I guess. And like the other Phobos Marines, they appear to have the smoke keyword, really quite a good defensive stratagem for both cover and -1 to hit. Next up we have the Reavers, 5 to 10 models in the unit once more. They gain scouts the same as the Incursors it would seem, so it looks like both of those can threaten into the midfield, but not quite as far as the Infiltrators. You can still upgrade them to the grav shoots, so they could have deep strike instead if that was more useful. Their weapons are kind of similar and very anti-infantry in nature, either bolt carbines with strength 4 and AP 0, or the special issue bolt pistols with AP 1 and combat blades. The only really interesting thing about them is they all get precision, which does mean that they can affect enemy characters before the rest of the unit, which I guess if you're fighting against a lightly armoured character buffing a unit, they could be actually somewhat threatening. They're not going to worry things like Terminator characters though. Otherwise, for their Terror Troop types rules, they've got a -1 leadership debuff in a 6-inch aura, definitely nice enough. Plus, to go hand in hand with that, they trigger Battle Shock in both players' fight phases for units that they're in engagement with, meaning that at the -1 leadership, your opponent is somewhat likely to fail. I think it's only got limited use though in your own charge phase, as the opponents will recover it at the start of their command phase. The grapnels still allow them to jump to the top of buildings and things, which is quite nice. I must admit with this datasheet though, unless they're very cheap, I can't really see Reavers being a particularly tempting choice any more than they are now. Sticking with the Phobos, and next up we have the Eliminators. These guys still come in their 3 model units. They get the Infiltrator's keyword to set up in the mid-board if you want to, maybe on a high ruin for that plunging fire could be kind of interesting. And they also have the Stealth keyword for a -1 to hit, which seems to have replaced the boosted save that they previously got in cover. In this incarnation, they still don't have any choice of their sniper round whatsoever. The Bolt Sniper Rifle just takes the single shot at Strength 5, AP -2, but it's now gone up to a damage 3 instead of the mortal wounds, at least most of the time it would seem. It's got the heavy keyword, so it'll still be hitting on 2s if you're stationary, or 3s if you move. The last fusel still seems to be fairly good and pretty general purpose, though a bit more skewed to taking out light tanks now rather than heavies, as it's only strength 9, so won't be wounding tough vehicles and anything but a 5+. I still think that Instigated Bolt Carbine still looks absolutely excellent. It means they get to reposition under covering fire, basically move shoot moving with the unit if they've got an instigator in there. So you can just get a lot more movement towards objectives if you need to, or pop in and out of cover remaining safe all the time. It's not even that terrible as a sniper weapon either, it's pretty much a bolt sniper but with strength 4 not 5. However though, if the unit does decide to remain stationary, it gets a mark the target special rule. If you're static, then you get the chance for some big mortal wound damage. Any 6s to wound get the devastating wounds ability, and that really is quite a devastating rule when they have a flat damage of 3. Looks pretty brutal, but you do have to get a bit lucky for that. Could be kind of interesting ploughed into the Oath of Moment target potentially. Reroll all those wound rolls and fish for some massive 6s. Still potentially looking very interesting I think. Decent looking damage output, some move shoot move shenanigans, and a small unit that should be at least fairly low in points cost. Could be an interesting one for midfield objectives. They are quite flexible to use now. The Scout squads have been split down into 2 datasheets. Now you either get the ones from the standard kit or the Scout Sniper ones. Scouts, as you might expect, get the Infiltrators and the Scout special rule as well, so they can both set up in the midfield and also redeploy if you want to otherwise. They're not a battle line unit as they were troops in days past, but I guess you can still run quite a lot of them given 2 datasheets now. I'd say perhaps the biggest deal for Scouts is that they gained an extra wound. That means they're on 2 wounds now, and they're not going to be quite as vulnerable to damage 1 firepower. It could kind of remove them very easily, and they were the best target for that in the Space Marine army if the rest of your models were 2 wounds normally. Otherwise, the shotguns retain assault. The sergeants surprisingly retain a lot of access to things like thunder hammers and power fists and things. Wasn't really expecting that given that the kit doesn't come with it, and Games Workshop has been removing a lot of non-kit specific options. I still will be a bit skeptical about that being reprinted when the codex comes out. This unit doesn't get the camo cloak option anymore, looks like that's just locked to the snipers as their model with it. Their special rule allows them to return to reserve if there's no enemy too nearby. Put them in strategic reserve and potentially loop back around the enemy, maybe towards the end of the game. Their partners in crime are the Scout Sniper Squad. Their sniper rifles got a lot more vicious at strength 4, AP -2 and damage 2. They might actually have some sort of competition with the Eliminators now, where they were very outclassed before. Their rules are Infiltrators and Stealth, but not Scouts interestingly enough. Still means they can set up in the midfield, potentially on a high ruin if you wanted to, and they're a -1 to hit when they're shot due to those camo cloaks I presume. Their special rule though is really quite a powerful one. Concealed positions means that the unit just can't be targeted with ranged attacks greater than 12 inches away. They can be very safe to enemy reprisals if they're not set up too aggressively. Makes them a pretty interesting unit for potentially holding down a home field point for the Space Marines, or being deployed on a really far-flung objective that your opponent can't reach otherwise. Pretty much impunity to sit there and deal a bit of damage, unless they can actually get close. Looks like quite an interesting unit I think. It'll be interesting to see who wins out for forward deployment purposes between these guys Eliminators and Infiltrators. Looking through the rest of the Space Marine squads now, and we'll start out with the new shiny Infernus squad. These guys are the Intercessor equivalents with the Pyre Blasters, still got the 2 wounds and the 3+ save, only objective control 1 and no battle line, and they strike with their Pyreblaster Flamers at d6 hits with strength 5 AP 0 damage 1 and ignores cover. Very nasty against hordes, a bit underwhelming against most other stuff. Their special rule is to inflict battle shock on an enemy infantry unit that they hit, a chance to make them fail that in the shooting phase hopefully. Having auto-hitting weapons as well, and quite a lot of them, they're very interesting for Overwatch. If the opponent gets too close to these with a horde unit, then they can barbecue them. The Blade Guard Veteran's new incarnation has a fairly similar stat line to before. They still get the 3 wounds and the 4+ invul save, though it does look like their Storm Shield no longer gives them a +1 to their saving throw, so they're down to a base save of 3+ against AP 0 weapons. They still seem like a solid, tanky, and fairly dangerous squad in combat. Their mastercrafted power weapons have lost a touch of AP like quite a few have, but still strike with a pretty respectable 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 per guy. Their special rule is called Blade Guard. Basically each fight phase you can choose whether you want a little bit of extra damage or a little bit of extra durability, either getting to reroll hit rolls of 1 or reroll saving throws of 1, usually around a 17% damage increase or 20% durability increase there. Nothing absolutely enormous, probably best to go for the 1 depending on whether you're fighting first or second. Seem useful though, and quite a dangerous unit for characters to attach to. Next up we've got the Consolidated Firstborn Command Squad. This one's got a set unit composition of 5 models now, 1 Apothecary, 1 Company Ancient, 1 Company Champion and 2 Company Veterans. This datasheet has also absorbed them as the flexible Veterans unit. Looks like all of these guys from the Apothecary down to the Veterans all get 3 wounds in the squad now, a nice tough defensive profile, and each of the specialists basically functions as a mini version of their Primaris equivalents. The Apothecary allows you to resurrect 1 destroyed model, excluding character models from the unit each time. You get to do that in your command phase. The Astartes banner, the same as the others, gives +1 objective control now, and the Champion allows you to heroic intervene for 0 CP, +1 to advance and charge, and also has a whole bunch of precision attacks that are good for striking characters. The last 2 veterans have some very flexible war gear choices. They can still take a shield for a 4+ invul save, though no +1 to your regular save now, or they can take all manner of special or combat weapons. Looks kind of interesting, though I feel like it's a high value unit if your opponent does manage to shoot any of them. If they don't manage to pay too much for a premium for all their fancy bits, they could be interesting though as a retinue for a character. Next up, we have a unit that I feel is a bit harder to be excited about with the index rules. The Vanguard Veteran Squad have been kind of gutted with their weapon choice, and again they're one of these units that's been split into 2 different ones now. You can either fill them with this datasheet, which is the on foot version with power armor, and the one with the jump packs has got its own distinct datasheet now. The on foot version does have its selling points. It gains scout 6 inches, so it could be kind of handy in a dedicated transport like a Rhino maybe. Plus on the turn that they charge they get lethal hits on their melee as well. Not too bad now they're swinging with lower strength weapons. Unfortunately though, I feel like the weapon profile just is very unexciting. Weirdly enough they get to customize their pistols, but the only weapons they can strike with in combat are called heirloom weapons. Regardless of whether they're modelled with a thunder hammer, a power fist, or a relic blade, they all strike with strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1, and 4 attacks at that profile. I feel like that was a bit unexpected really. They do have plenty of thunder hammers in the kit. I was thinking that Games Workshop would probably still make the hammer and fist distinct, as they have with plenty of other units. I'm not sure anyone would have missed the power weapons too much though. I feel like you could have consolidated them into an heirloom weapon profile, but even then I would have kind of guessed that it would have been AP2. Overall it's a bit on the underwhelming side to be honest. I feel like they've been kind of forced into the same sort of niche as Assault Marines now. Though weirdly Assault Marines can actually still fight with things like Power Fist and Eviscerator profiles, so strangely they're better at killing tanks and things, whereas these guys are just kind of good for blending medium to light infantry. The Jump Pack Vanguard Veteran Squad is very much the same, but obviously 12-inch movement with fly. They also get Deep Strike instead of Scouts as well, so they can't go bounding up the board turn 1. Overall I feel like these are a bit on the disappointing side. I feel like they were quite commonly used as a really fun unit where you could customise their melee loadout and also get that scary melee into combat quite easily. Still could be good with the right points cost, but I feel like it would have to be kind of cheap to compensate for them not being particularly strong against harder targets. The Sternguard Veteran Squad is very much the new Primaris version that we saw with the Leviathan datasheet download. These guys again have lost a lot of weapon options it would seem. Not sure if they might gain them back in the codex if they do get a full multi-part plastic kit, but my hopes aren't enormously high. All of them need to take either the combi weapons or the Sternguard bolt rifles, Out of the two against the vast majority of targets, the Stone Guard bolt rifles tend to win out. The combi weapons do have one niche in toughness 5 or better infantry, but I feel like it's usually going to be better to be stronger against everything else than that. The bolt rifles get 2 shots out to 24 inches, or 3 shots out to 12. They get assault and heavy like the intercessor bolt rifles, and also devastating wounds as well. They also get a Stone Guard heavy bolter, which gets devastating wounds too, a little bit more mortal chance there, and so do their bolt pistols as well. I feel like the Stone Guard special rule though really is quite interesting. That's called Bolter Drill, and once per battle in your shooting phase after the unit has shot, if it wipes out an enemy unit with its attacks, then it gets to fire again, laying down all that bolter fire once more. Feels like this is a unit that you really want to use to just finish off an enemy unit and then lay their full firepower into something else for more damage. Looks like quite a nice cleanup unit for that once per game move. I still think they're kind of fun, but they have shifted in focus a bit. They're not going to be jumping out of a drop pod with a whole bunch of combi melters blasting vehicles now. Onto the Terminators, and the new chunky models have new chunky rules. I've got toughness 5 and a 4+ invul save. Very hard for any sort of small arms to make any sort of headway into now. You get 5 to 10 models in their squad. 1 out of each 5 can take one of the heavy options, assault cannon, missiles, or flamer. The rest get storm bolters and either power fists or chain fists, you can choose which. The sergeant is locked into a power weapon, but now you don't have to feel too bad about killing him, as he doesn't bring extra leadership or anything. Power fists are a bit more mid-strength these days. Without additional rules, they aren't going to do too well into vehicles, but will be great against elites. Chain fists will be worse against elites and lighter infantry, as they hit on a 4+, but they get the anti-vehicle 3+, which does mean that they'll be excellent against some armies like knights. Otherwise, they get free rapid ingress with their teleport homer. Put down a teleport homer marker on the board, and then you can use rapid ingress on that in the next turn. Kind of fun to cause a little bit of anxiety with your opponent and potentially make them move a bit weird. And then they also have Fury of the First as well. That's actually a composite special rule that allows them to ignore hit, weapon skill, and ballistic skill modifiers, and also get a +1 to hit against the Oath of Moment target as well, as if the Space Marines needed any more damage against that. Looks all around pretty solid, very tough, and some generalist melee that should be scary to everything in large enough numbers. Again, at the right points cost, these guys I could see being pretty good. The Terminator Assault Squad come with Thunderhammers and Shields or Twin Lightning Claws once more. The Lightning Claws do get a proper Lightning Claw profile, Strength 5, AP -2, and re-rolling wound rolls, really quite a nice general threat there. The Thunderhammers hit on 4s and are only damage 2 now, but do have devastating wounds on 6s. Storm Shields, as with the rest of them, don't improve their saves anymore, which is kind of a shame as that was rather strong on the Terminators. It does give the Storm Shield flavour though, a wounds of 4, very nice against damage 1 or damage 3 attacks, but less so against really heavy hits or damage 2. All Terminators seem to get a 4+ invul save regardless these days, so it's not helping out with the invul. Otherwise, they've got the same teleport homer rule, and then their special rule is to cause a battle shock test whenever they charge into the foe. Again, nice enough, it might stop the foe from using an interruption stratagem or a durability one in the fight phase, but they should recover it in their command phase, so it's not going to be long-lived. They miss out on Fury of the First that the other Terminators get, which I think is quite a big loss, particularly the ignoring modifiers. Still seems like a very scary unit though, definitely could be an interesting one with characters to attach to. Finally, we also seem to have the Relic Terminator squad still here. I was wondering if they might get caught up in the purge of Heresy era models from 40k, but it seems that as they had an entry in the previous codex, they still get an entry in this index. Hopefully they'll still have that going forward. I'd still be a bit apprehensive as to when the codex rolls round though. Their datasheet still seems to be even more flexible than the other Terminators. They get the same Fury of the First rule as the standard ones, so that's quite a good asset I think. They don't get the teleport homer rule as they don't come with one, but they've got quite a lot more interesting war gear, including things like the Reaper autocannon. That seems to have sustained hits and AP -1 strength 7, and bonus mortals with devastating wounds as well. They can also take the grenade harness to get the grenades keyword as well, just in case you wanted to use that stratagem. Next up, we've got the Aggressor Squad. 3 to 6 models in the unit here. Gravis armor went +1 toughness, so it's quite nice against strength 3 or strength 5 now. And broadly speaking, most of their weapons became twin links, both the range profile of the Auto Boltstorm Gauntlets and the Flamestorm Gauntlets. Roughly the same attacks, but twin links, and they also lost the Assault keyword as well, which will be kind of big for them moving around the board quickly. I feel like they've skewed slightly from being a close range shooting unit with a bit of melee into being kind of balanced in both. The Power Fists being twin linked in combat is actually quite a big deal. They only lost the one attack on that profile, and that means that reroll wound rolls probably outweighs that. Twin linked on them is actually kind of useful. It will allow them to punch up against tough stuff like toughness 12 vehicles. Their special rule is close quarters firepower though. Each time you fire your weapons against the closest enemy units, you get to improve the weapon's AP by -1. Makes all of that volume fire a lot more general purpose. Still look pretty interesting with the right price, but a lot of things are still going to kill them very easily. Plus they're going to be harder to deliver them before, given that they can't advance and shoot. I suppose Devastator Doctrine might help there a little though. Centurions next, and we've both got the Assault Squad and the Devastator Squad. These guys also got a toughness boost all the way up to toughness 7. They are going to be moving incredibly slowly around the board now. They're sharing their movement with Death Guard Terminators up 4 inches. For war gear, their combat's still just scary against most things. They've lost 1 attack with their siege drills, but they're still hitting on a 3+, strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3. Going to be great against most things. And they do have a fair amount of firepower as well, getting chest-mounted bolters, which are now called Centurion bolters as opposed to Hurricane bolters. They're a little bit less excessive with the amount of firepower that they can deal. Maybe not the worst to have them focus a bit more on melee, I suppose. The Twin Flamers and the Twin Melter Guns they can pick up are now also twin linked rather than just firing twice the number of shots. Maybe skewing a little bit more to being a melee unit as opposed to one that does some pretty savage anti-infantry shooting too. Their special rule is called Annihilator Protocols. This one means that if you're in combat with a monster vehicle or fortification unit, then their weapons get sustained hits too. A great big 50% damage boost on weapons that are already kind of good at that seems very nice to me. Looks like the assault launchers are now just giving you the grenades keyword, a little bit on the niche side that. I think that the bolters will be better unless they cost a lot more points. Next up we've got the Centurion Devastators. They've had similar kind of stat line changes and again are moving very slowly now. Perhaps the most interesting things here are their long ranged weapons. They're one of the easiest ways to spam the new grav cannon should you want to, besides Devastators I suppose. And on the chest weapons they've got the Centurion bolters once more, or they can swap that out for the Centurion missile launcher, D3 shots with blast at strength 9, AP 2 and damage D3. Otherwise they can also mount twin linked heavy bolters or a twin las cannon. Unfortunately, that is just a las cannon with the twin links rule now, rather than 2 of them. Overall, it does mean that they are generally losing a fair bit of firepower, I think, compared with previously. Might mean that they can cost a little bit less in terms of points, though, I suppose. In combat, their Centurion Fists are actually worth a little bit more now. They're still not back up to Power Fists, as they used to be in quite a long time ago, but now they're 3 attacks hitting on a 4, with a strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, so basically sort of like a heavy bolter kind of hit in close combat. Their special rule is to reroll hit rolls of 1 or 4 rerolls versus units on objectives. Potentially means that even if they aren't firing a whole ton of shots due to the twin links rule, they will be rerolling the hit roll and the wound roll against certain targets. Kinda don't really need Oath of Moment at that point. Moving into more fast attack foot troops now. First up we have the Assault Squad, which has now been split into 2 different datasheets. This one's the one on foot without jump packs, and the other one can soar through the sky. The foot one's got a kind of similar weapon loadout to how it was before. No massive consolidation of all melee weapons like the Vanguard vets got. It means weirdly these guys can actually pack some anti-tank punch. They can take that Eviscerator, which is now strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, plus also something like a Power Fist. Otherwise they'll be swinging with a whole bunch of attacks at strength 4, AP -1, only 1 pip of strength behind the Vanguard vets now. The foot version special rule is decent enough I think. You get a big damage boost, either sustained hits 1, lethal hits, or lance. Lance seems like the one to go for if you're on the charge, as that's +1 to wound. Pretty excellent there. It does only apply to the Astartes chainswords though, so it's not things like your Eviscerator or Power Fist. Otherwise though, I think that most people are going to be a bit more excited by the jump pack version of the Assault Squad. That's the one that we're more used to seeing. These ones are basically the same sort of unit profile, but 12-inch movement and fly. They get to deep strike unlike the other squad, and their special rule is Hammer of Wrath. Each time this unit ends a charge move, select one enemy unit within engagement range and roll 1d6 for each model in this unit. For every 4+, the enemy suffers 1 mortal wound. To be honest, just that special rule alone is really quite good on the charge. For a 5-man unit, that'd be around 2 or 3 mortal wounds on average, never mind what the squad actually does with its melee weapons. For a massed up unit, you could be hitting the enemy with around 5 mortal wounds on average if you're rolling 10 dice at them. I feel like between that and their boosted things like Power Fist or Eviscerators, it's kind of strange that the Assault Squads can definitely outfight the Vanguard veterans now. Doesn't really make too much sense to me, that one. Sticking with the jump packs, next up we've got the Suppressor Squad, still in just the 3 model units. Their accelerator autocannons haven't changed too much, still got the heavy keyword and hit on 4s if you're moving, strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2. Looks like they'll still be a unit that's trading off between using their good movement or staying still and actually hitting well. They've got a smoke keyword, so can get cover and -1 to hit if they want to try and survive some enemy shooting, and their datasheet rule is called Suppression Fire. Rather than cancelling and turning off the Overwatch stratagem now, instead this one is now a -1 to hit debuff for one enemy unit. You simply have to hit them with one of your Accelerator autocannon rounds, and then until the next turn, provided your suppressors are still on the battlefield and haven't been killed or something, they're -1 to hit with their ranged and melee weapons. Quite a nice rule to be able to ping out into something important for the enemy, and it doesn't look like it's limited on anything like infantry, so you could suppress things like tanks and vehicles as well. You just need to make sure that the suppressors don't die. Kind of a shame that they don't have cancel Overwatch. That's a massive stratagem in 10th edition, would have made them a really useful thing to have in the army. The Inceptors have seen some interesting changes. Like the other Gravis, they're toughness 6 now, so a little bit more tanky, and otherwise deep strike units that can come in from reserves. Like a fair few things, they've lost a bunch of shots but have gained a bunch of keywords. Both the Assault Bolters and the Plasma Exterminators basically have half the shots that they used to, but the Assault Bolters get the Assault keyword, Sustained hits 2 for 2 extra hits on 6s, and then twin linked as well to re-roll the wound roll. The Plasma Exterminators just get Assault and twin linked, maybe a little bit less good in terms of buffs there, but all the weapons also get pistol as well, so that's interesting for firing at vehicles that are in engagement range maybe, or even just firing enemy units that have engaged them. I think the pistol rule will be quite nice for them. Inceptors often wind up getting tagged in combat and having their firepower made redundant, so that would be some very nice insurance against that. Otherwise, they've got a rather interesting special rule called Meteoric Descent. If you're setting up via Deep Strike, then you can come down anywhere that's greater than 3 inch horizontally from your opponents, meaning that they can get to areas of the board that quite a lot can't. They're not allowed to charge after they've done that, but that could still be really quite nice for a precision strike, maybe jumping behind terrain with a fragile enemy unit, killing it, and then being safe themselves next turn. Looks interesting enough. That deep strike arrival is pretty threatening. Getting into some more heavy support foot troops now. First up we have the Hellblasters. Their plasma incinerators have gained some similar kind of changes to the intercessors. They're all consolidated in one profile now, but get both the assault and the heavy keywords, so they move around quite quickly or shoot quite hard when they're static. Otherwise their profile gets 2 shots out to 24-inch range, means they can afford to be a little bit more standoffish and not get quite as close as they used to, at least with the rapid fire variant I suppose. Otherwise their profiles aren't too different, they have lost a tiny bit of AP. They've got quite a good general purpose profile. I feel like they'll be really quite nice with things like lethal hits or Oath of Moment to re-roll the hits and the wounds. I feel like one of the really fun things on the Hellblasters though is that basically when they die they get to shoot in death on a 3+. Kind of a throwback to how they were in 8th edition when a lot of people used to play them with Ancients and fire them on death when they overcharge. And it seems that in a designer's note they specifically say that you can still do that. If you roll a 1 on your hazardous check, as well as firing the first time, your Hellblaster can go out in a blaze of glory and fire once more. Really quite cool for some return fire in the enemy turn as well if they are removing them with shooting. I think that's just quite a fun rule. Fingers crossed that 10th edition might be time for the Hellblaster to shine. They have had a bit of a rough time of it throughout 9th. The Eradicators are next, and kind of unsurprisingly, they've lost their double shooting rule. Games Workshop do seem to like giving that to new units and then taking it away in the next edition. Admittedly though, their melter rifles are still very scary against tanks and vehicles. The shots are a single shot with strength 9, AP -4 and damage D6, melter 2 if you can get within 9-inch range, though they have lost range overall and are only 18 inches in total. That is a little bit problematic for coming in from reserves, as if you come in from reserves you're not going to be within 9 inches, so you can't get the +2 quite as easily as now. Their total obliteration rule has shifted a fair bit though. Rather than just getting double the shots, they instead get 4 rerolls to hit and wounds versus monsters and vehicle targets. I feel like that might be a pretty reasonable change to be honest. Eradicators could actually be pretty lethal to light and heavy infantry as well as just being good against their more intended targets. Looks like they're probably going to be a fair bit more niche in the Space Marine army from now on. Interestingly, against those kind of targets, that's actually going to be better than double shooting the vast majority of the time if they're wounding on a 5, though I feel like their overall power and sheer danger that they have might have come down a bit. Previously they would have been wounding any vehicle on a 4+ or better basically. Now most things are going to require a 5 for them to wound unless it's quite light things like rhinos. I guess they might come down in points a fair bit to compensate them for those changes though. The new version of the Devastator squad is still very flexible and you can mix and match any of your favourite heavy weapons. As with normal foot troops and heavy weapons type rules, it does mean that they hit on a 4+ when they're moving and a 3+ if they're static. It looks like on the back of their data card they can also take heavy flamers now, which is kind of interesting. It looks like there's no restriction on being Blood Angels for those anymore, so it looks like you can have a Bernie squad if you want to. The Sergeant war gear is still very flexible, a lot of it does come in the box with them I suppose, though I would say that their supporting heavy weapons rules have got a bit underwhelming. The Signum now just gives you ignores cover if you're static as opposed to a +1 to hit regardless, and the Armorium Cherub, rather than doubling down on one unit's firepower, that just allows you to change a single dice from a failed results to a 6 to hit, and you get to do that after seeing the roll. I guess it's pretty nice for getting a critical hit and triggering things like lethal hits or sustained hits or something, or could just be good for getting an extra hit with a las cannon when otherwise you might have failed. Will be interesting to see what their battlefield role winds up being in 10th edition. They could certainly pack a bunch of focused las cannons, which is quite nice for some anti-armor. I say perhaps their role that they often have with multi-melters or grav cannons and drop pods might have got a little bit worse. The multi-melters in particular aren't going to be in effective range quite as much. For their missile launcher on a missile launcher Primaris counterparts, we've got the Desolation squads. These guys don't really seem to have changed enormously going from 9th to 10th. After the Super Frag and the Super Crack rockets, I'd still probably go for the Super Crack I think. Damage d6+1 is very nice, and their strength 10. Really though, I still think that the most exciting thing about them is their ignores line of sight firepower. Their Vengor launcher is still pretty savage, hitting on a 2 with strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2. Really quite a good artillery piece all on its own there, never mind the fact that it's got targeter optics, so ignores the normal penalties for indirect fire. The rest of the squad can also chip in with their Castellan launchers as well, a little bit of strength 4 AP0 shooting to clear out hordes and things. Still quite a scary artillery unit that can then choose to step forward and fire some direct fire crack rockets too. Lastly, and perhaps least for the Astartes units, we've got the Poor Servitors. These guys still come in 4 model units, and now interestingly enough they can join the Tech Marine as their bodyguard, or they can even join the unit that the Tech Marine joins with the bodyguard as well, adding a bunch of extra chaff models to the squad. Their toughness 4, so I guess that would be the same to wound as other things that they'd be able to join, so it wouldn't cause any issues with the wound roll there. The model's air objective control 0, so the days of Servitors camping objectives on the cheap are gone I'm afraid. And otherwise they still pack the same heavy weapons that they did, potentially hitting a little bit more accurately as they hit on a 4+, but a 3+ if they're with a Tech Marine, and then if they also trigger the heavy keyword as well, they'd hit on a 2+ if they're static as well. They've kind of gone from extremely underwhelming shooting to actually frighteningly accurate. Will be interesting to see if they actually wind up competing with things like Devastator squads if they've got an attached Tech Marine there. I guess you will probably still be paying a big premium for the heavy weapons though. Otherwise, if you don't go for the heavies, they can have a single very inaccurate servo arm attack, and they seem to have acquired a 6+ Bionics invul save, which I don't think they had before. A tiny bit harder to kill with high AP weapons, I suppose. They do look kind of interesting. I wonder if it could work out for a Tech Marine to join a tactical squad or something, and have some gun servitors along for the rise to put out a few more heavy weapons. Let's go for bikes and land speeders next, and starting out we've got the Primaris version of the Outrider squad. These guys have got a much more flexible datasheet at last, 3 to 6 models in the squad, and they've also taken a leaf out of the Bike Squad's books, as now they can be joined by an Invader ATV in the same unit, really quite a big and chunky unit of Space Marine fast moving bikers there. They still move fairly quickly, though a tiny bit less so than before, at 12 inches rather than 14. They're still fairly tanky, with toughness 5, 4 wounds and a 3+ save, though I must admit their damage output isn't really all that exciting. 4 attacks with an Astartes chainsword, and nothing really special like the extra attacks they got on the charge before. And their twin bolt rifle has even lost a few shots. It's only 2 shots now, though it does get twin linked to re-roll the wound roll. That is a bit of a downgrade as well. Their special rule I don't think is amazingly interesting either. They get turbo boost, the old bike rule that they used to have at stock anyway. I guess it means that they could move 18 inches and still shoot in Devastator I suppose, or advance and charge in Assault Doctrine. I guess that might be worth something for some very long charge threat range. Overall though, they certainly seem like a unit that's doing a lot more in terms of speed or durability than actually killing anything besides light infantry. The Invader ATVs can still be fielded independently as well, but they have dropped down to just a unit size of 1 now. You can't run them in squadrons anymore. Maybe not the best news if you happen to have loads of them, though I suppose you could seed some into Outrider squads. Their stat line's fairly similar with 8 wounds. Their weapons have been tweaked a little bit, with shorter range multi-melters, and the Onslaught Gatling Cannon loses AP but gains devastating wounds, kind of similar to the Assault Cannon pretty much. I do quite like their special rule though, which kind of feels fun and fluffy. The Outrider Escort rule means that if your opponent targets one of your biker units or mounted units nearby, this guy can then get angry and defensive and fire at whatever just shot them. That seems kind of fun, though I suppose they'd have to be at least somewhat close by, as the Onslaught Gatling Cannon is the longer range weapon, and that's still range 24. Always going to be nice though when you get a few more shots and a chance for some mortal wounds. For their firstborn cousins, we have the Bike Squad. Again, fairly similar profiles here, and potentially having a fair bit more damaging threat. They can still take all the special weapons, so can be porting about melter guns and plasma guns and inferno pistols, nice close range shooting, and even have some specialist melee in combat with a power fist. I'm sure that you might well be paying a bit of a premium for a bunch of these, but they do seem a little bit more general purpose and threatening to things that aren't light infantry, at least compared with base outriders. Their special rule is also turbo boost as well, and again they're in a similar sort of squad size that can take an attack bike. Attack bikes are also mirroring the Invader ATV. They've got the same fire support rule, which means that they could be firing multi-melters or heavy bolters at a target threatening their charges. Otherwise, not really the most enormous changes in the world. The twin bolt gun's just twin links rather than extra shots, but it has actually gained an extra wound, which is quite nice, I think. It's certainly a bit more tanky against damage to weapons. Looks like you can still field these in units of 1 to 3 at least. Finally, for the bike units, we still have the Scout Bike Squad as well. These get the Scout keyword, perhaps unsurprisingly, could be setting up for a first turn charge if they really wanted to. Like the regular Scouts, these guys have also gained a wound, so at least they're not going to be catastrophically behind the other bike squads. Otherwise, they're still generally quite threatening, put out really quite a lot of small arms between their shotguns and the twin bolt guns. They can also take that Astartes grenade launcher as well, which like the guard versions has got a lot more threatening. Strength 9, AP 2 and damage D3 is kind of cool. Again, they've perhaps kept a surprising amount of Sergeant Wargear options for a unit that doesn't come with them in the box. Again, I'd be a little bit skeptical about those staying in the codex, but I suppose we'll see. Their special rule is a Strategic Reserve one, which allows them to arrive from Strategic Reserve in the enemy deployment zone. Definitely not worthless, but I sort of feel like it works against their Scout rule and the fact that they've got good movement. In general, you'd usually want to be starting them on the board, I think. Overall, interesting enough Scout moves, and a fair bit of anti-infantry firepower there. Next up, we've got the Storm Speeders, and I feel like Games Workshop might have wanted to sell a few of these. They're quite a lot tougher at T9, 11 wounds, and a 3+ save. Previously, the other ones were fast and hard hitting, but kind of very easy to kill. At least small arms won't be taking half as many chunks out of them now. The Hellstrike attacks with a whole flurry of attacks at AP 0. It is the anti-infantry one, I guess. But really, I think the exciting thing about this datasheet is that it has one of the rules that buffs the rest of your army shooting. Pick a unit that you've shot, the rest of your army all gets an extra AP -1 on the attacks against that particular unit. Again, this is an absolutely enormous damage boost, and is really quite a good one to work with Oath of Moment, I think. You could be re-rolling all hit rolls, all wound rolls, and then have extra AP against a unit. Between all that, I feel like there's just not a lot of units in the game that are going to stand against that kind of firestorm from a Space Marine army. You could definitely use it on other things and split the buffs though. Overall really interesting, that rule alone is massive. The Thunderstrike is kind of similar. This one hits on 2s with its targeting arrays, Storm Fury missiles, a single shot at strength 12 AP3, and then a Thunderstrike Las Talon with a couple of shots at strength 9 AP3 damage D6+1. Again, maybe the most interesting thing is its special rule, as it really hurts monsters and vehicles. If it shot one of those, then the rest of your army gets a +1 to wound when you're attacking them this phase. Absolutely massive, and yet another big damage boost that you can use against enemy units. Having things like Incursors and Storm Speeders running around does seem like the rest of your army's shooting just gets absolutely enormous. Lastly of the three, we've got the Hammer Strike. This one's kind of generally dangerous with a whole bunch of strength 9 attacks. Even the Crackstorm grenades seem to have gone up to strength 9, it would seem. The Melter Destroyer I think is the most threatening one. 3 shots with the Melter rule and the speeds to actually get within 9-inch range. Really quite scary at Melter 2 with 3 attacks there. I'd say its special rule isn't quite as exciting as the other two. One unit that it shot gets to ignore the benefit of cover for the rest of that turn. Maybe okay for a very strong unit that's dug in behind there, but certainly a lot less generally applicable than extra AP. Still good though, it looks like it's really quite a threatening beast in its own right, this one. Next up we have the Land Speeders, and it seems not to be outdone. The regular Land Speeder also has a debuff type rule. Its base stats have lost a tiny bit of movement, but it's gone up to toughness 7. Overall though, no major changes. It does seem that the Land Speeder can't be taken in squadrons anymore, so I guess you're just running them individually, and it can deep strike like the Storm Speeders can as well, though I feel like with fly and very good movement, starting them on the board isn't the worst idea. The Land Speeder's marking target type rule gives you a +1 to hit and ignore cover for blast weapons that target an enemy unit, perhaps tying into the fluff of its spotting targets for whirlwinds and things. Seems to just affect any blast units out of the Space Marine arsenal though. Could help things like Vindicators if you wanted, or a whole barrage of frag rockets. Again, it's a really powerful buff if you have the blast weapons to go with it. The Land Speeder Tornado is the one that mounts the assault cannon or heavy flamer, And this one's got a rather fun special rule called Strafing Enfilade. This one's almost kind of like a bombing run for planes. If you move over an enemy unit, then presumably you strafe them with the heavy flamer or assault cannon. You roll 6 dice and they take a mortal wound for every roll of a 4+. Probably means that you've then put your landspeeder in harm's way, but I suppose at least you've done a bunch of damage. The Landspeeder Typhoon is a bit more of a backfield type unit. This one's got the long-range Typhoon missile launcher at strength 9, AP 2 and damage D6 now. And the special rule for this one is a move shoot move one. Basically, after you've shot, then you get to move D6 inches. That might well be enough to just tuck yourself back behind cover and remain safe from enemy guns. Always annoying if your opponent's got enemy shooting that they've got to deal with, but they can't actually catch up with it. Seems like having one or two of these playing around in and out of a backfield ruin or something could be rather nasty and annoying to have to face. Moving on to more vehicles, and let's talk walkers and dreadnoughts now. We'll start out with the Invicta Tactical Warsuit. This one's been changed from its slightly surprising infiltrate type rule to a scout type rule. Now it gets to move forward in the first turn of the game, as opposed to actually literally set up right next to the opponent's army, which I feel like maybe makes a little bit more logical sense, I think. Its toughness has gone up to 8, so it's a bit less fragile against small arms. Bolters and things won't be taking quite as big chunks out of it, though it's still going to be just as vulnerable to anti-tank guns. It's also a little bit slower than it was before, at 8-inch movement rather than 10. Weapons-wise, its Iron Hail Cannon has lost shots for the Twin Linked rule. Not too bad though, at a kind of mid-strength, strength 9 weapon with damage 3. That can still be somewhat efficient to allow it to punch up against tough stuff, and also re-roll 3+ to wound things like Terminators. The Incendium Cannon, on the other hand, gained a bit of strength and ignores cover. Could be interesting enough for an Overwatch attack perhaps. Maybe the most interesting thing about the Invicta is that it works quite well in concert with other Phobos units now. If you keep this thing near to one and within 6 inches of a Phobos infantry unit, if your opponent shoots it, then he basically gets to return fire, and the Invicta can protect the Phobos units and fire at the enemy unit that just shot it. Invicta warsuits do really have quite a lot of guns, a twin-linked stubber, the Fragstorm grenade launcher, a heavy bolter, and their main gun, and that could be quite a lot of shooting to lay waste to an enemy infantry squad or something. Seems like quite a nice rule to work in concert. I quite like the feel of it, basically a big mech that's escorting your troops. I would be kind of surprised if it winds up being one of the best damage and defense units for the points though. Next up and into the Dreadnoughts, we have our standard boxy Dreadnought. Looks like this guy still lives in the Codex, even though his model's been taken out of commission. I guess that this is the datasheet that you now use to represent the model for the Venerable Dreadnought, which I guess is a bit more of a modern one. This Dreadnought's now Toughness 9, a 2+ save, though like most of the rest of them it lost its -1 damage, so it will be a little bit easier to kill with things like Power Fists and similar. It still packs the vast majority of the more standard vehicle-mounted heavy weapons and things. In combat it still strikes with a bunch of attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3. Lost a little bit of AP there, like a few of the other melee weapons. The unit ability of the Dreadnought does seem rather good though. It's basically Wisdom of the Ancients, the stratagem that you had before, but as a permanent aura. Reroll hit rolls of 1 within a 6-inch aura for nearby infantry. I feel like the Dreadnought has basically become your captain of old. I feel like that one might be most useful alongside a gunline space reinforce. Have this guy in your army alongside other powerful units shooting the enemy. And it's just quite a nice thing to have along. It'll do its own damage and also amp up your other infantry units nearby. I guess might be a bit redundant though, if and when they're firing at the Oath of Moment target. Next up, a supposedly removed model that still seems to be in the index is the Contemptor Dreadnought. Games Workshop did say that they were pulling the rules for this thing, or at least the Horus Heresy version of the model. It does seem that the older plastic kit version that had its datasheet in the old Space Marine Codex still seems to have made it into the index though. This is the one that gets either the option of either the multi-melter or the Keres pattern assault cannon. You don't get things like twin Volkite culverins or anything. Again, like the regular Dreadnought, looks fairly tanky. A 2+ save, toughness 9, 10 wounds, and also an invul save 2. Perhaps one of the most outstanding things about this guy though is the way that he gets up on death. Even in death I serve is quite a nice quote for the Dreadnought, and the first time that the opponent kills him on a 2+, he simply just stands up again at the end of the phase with d6 wounds remaining. Quite a big rule, and to have it happen quite so reliably is kind of surprising. I feel like that could be really quite powerful. Get him to the centre of the army. If the opponent has to kill him in melee or something, they basically guarantee that he gets another turn to cause a bit of carnage, standing up again and shooting and assaulting something. Quite a fun datasheet. Again, I guess probably won't be one of the most efficient damage dealers out there, but could be very disruptive with that rule alone. The Ironclad Dreadnought, again, is a little bit tougher to kill than your standard Dreadnought. It's got toughness 10 rather than toughness 9, I guess that will be relevant as there is a fair bit of Strength 9 out there. This one's maybe not so very different. You've got the choice of the different combat weapons, with a Chain Fist for an anti-vehicle 3+ now, the regular Dreadnought combat weapon. We can go for the big damage seismic hammer, which looks like it's a true anti-tank weapon at strength 14, AP -3, damage d6 +2, but you only get the 3 attacks with it. The Ironclad special rule is called Siegebreaker Protocol. This one allows you to target a vehicle or fortification in melee and get +1 to the hit roll and +1 to the wound roll with those already pretty scary melee attacks. I feel like they were probably already in trouble if this thing got into combat with them, but with that, that's pretty lethal. Kind of interesting to note this guy's Hurricane Bolter as well, rather than the Centurion Bolter, which was 3 shots and rapid fire 3. This one is rapid fire 6 and 6 shots at base, still 12 shots within 12 inches, but on top of that it's also picked up twin linked as well. I feel like Games Workshop have almost doubled up on their bolters there. 12 shots with twin links kind of implies that you might have 12 bolters firing at your foe. Looks like this thing is just fantastically efficient anti-infantry. Then we've got the now 3 flavours of Primaris Dreadnought. The Redemptor is the more balanced one with the fist and the big gun. Out of the 3 he's the tankiest as well now, as he's retains the -1 damage special rule with Duty Eternal, really quite a nice debuff, and unless Games Workshop choose to FAQ something in the core rules, it no longer caps out at 1. Unless they choose to write something different, he's basically immune to any damage 1 weapons. He's still tanky on top of that though, toughness 10, a 2+ save and 12 wounds. This thing is just fantastically durable now. Very good to have on the battle line, I suspect. Otherwise, its macroplasma is pretty similar. It's got d6 +1 shots rather than just d6, with a new blast rule, which will be nice. It will be a little bit less effective against vehicles though, as strength 9 doesn't wound everything on 3s these days. The heavy onslaught Gatling cannon is now AP 0 but has devastating wounds. Still going to be fairly general purpose, though I would guess that perhaps the macroplasma is still going to be most people's favourites. He still strikes in melee fairly hard, though his melee has lost a touch of punch. It's now no longer d3 +3 damage, but just 3, kind of similar to other Dreadnoughts. He was already kind of range focused, but is now even more so. For the melee focused Dreadnought though, we've got the Brutalis. He doesn't get any -1 damage, and he's a little bit slower than he was before at 8 inches, but still very tanky with that toughness 10, 2+, and 12 wounds. For his guns, his chest and fist weapons have become twin linked at the expense of a few shots, a bit of a side grade with a few of those I suppose. Now his choice is between the Brutalis fists and the Brutalis talons, and this time round in strike mode they're basically the same profile, strength 12, AP -2 and damage 3, but also twin linked, so you get to re-roll the wound roll and be really quite effective against wounding vehicles. The choice is that you can either get a sweep mode in melee with the talons at strength 7 and AP -2 to clear out hordes, or you can swap that out for just not having access to that and get those extra bolt shots. The Brutalis special rule is for mortal wound impact on the charge. He's really not messing about with these either. You roll the dice for how much you inflict. On a 2 to 3 it's d3, on a 4 to 5 it's a flat 3, and if you roll a big 6 then it's d3 +3 mortal wounds when he charges into the foe before any other damage. Looks pretty solid in combat as you'd expect. His range damage does seem to have been toned down a little bit due to the new twin linked though. Next up we've got the new ranged one on the block, similar defensive profile to the others, and the Ballistas Dreadnought basically packs 2 las cannons and a great big missile launcher, the missile launcher getting 2 shots, but also +1 strength compared with the regular frag and crack. He's also got storm bolters that are twin linked. Maybe he'll get some more options if he gets a full-fledged plastic kit with some different weapons. The Ballista special rule means that he's extra good at killing things that aren't too damaged. Each time he makes a ranged attack, provided the target isn't below half strength, you get to re-roll the hit roll, so really quite reliable to at least land the hits on the target. I guess it'll be a little bit less effective if the target's got Oath of Moment on it. Might be a bit of a redundant rule, but it means he could go after something else and still be pretty efficient at it. With those guns, he averages around about 7 wounds to a Rhino, or about 4 wounds to a Land Raider. The extra toughness does make a big difference. Moving on from walkers, let's talk through Space Marine artillery. I've just got the 2 pieces in the Thunderfire cannon and the Firestrike servo turret. Both of them have kind of got a similar profile now. Toughness 6 with a 2+ save and 6 wounds. They only move 3 inches, and now for the Thunderfire cannon as well as the Firestrike, they're basically counted as pretty much the same model. If the one dies, then the other does too. The new profile for the Thunderfire cannon spits out d6 +4 shots at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1. Not particularly good besides against light infantry. Maybe could be worth pairing with a land speeder if you actually want to deal some damage with it. Really, as with before, the main reason that you'd want to include one I think would be to hand out its Tremor Shells rule. Now it just gets it every time that it fires. You target an enemy infantry unit with it, as you probably would have been doing anyway, and that infantry units will have the -2 to move, advance and charge. It's really quite a big rule to slow down one big enemy infantry unit, particularly a high investment Terminator unit or something like that, and keep it out of the fight. If the Thunderfire is cheap enough, then that could be worth it, plus the occasional sniping of light infantry units on objectives maybe. Otherwise, the Fire Strike Servo Turret has got pretty much the same defensive profile. You can still field these in squads, but it's only squads of 1 to 2 now. These ones have had their guns changed slightly. Their ballistic skill is 2+ for both of them still, with the Tet Marine Gunner, and they're both twin-linked weapons, the autocannons being shots at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3, and the Fire Strike Last Talon is now 2 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage D6+1. The Last Talon's also gone out to 36 inches as well rather than 24, which I think makes it a lot better given just how immobile this thing is. I suppose you could always still advance and shoot it in Devastator Doctrine though. The Fire Strike special rule is to overwatch on a 4+ if you trigger it with the stratagem. That does seem at least fairly good to me. I feel like with 4 of those twin-linked Last Talon shots, that could well be worth it with a unit of 2 of them. Could be worth it for the damage alone, but particularly if you manage to destroy one enemy vehicle threat. They do look a little bit more efficient for their role now that they've got a bit of a longer range. Space Marine tanks and vehicles next, and we'll start with the anti-air. First up, we've got the Hunter with its single very big shot Sky Spear missile launcher, 1 shot hitting on a 2, strength 10, AP 3, and a big damage D6+2. Really quite scary stuff, and it really doesn't care about modifiers as it's got the heavy keyword, plus it even has a double down on that word of hitting it automatically pretty much. Against monsters and vehicles, it always hits on a 2+, even if you somehow have multiple stacking negative modifiers. Otherwise, it's also got devastating wounds if you get a wound roll of 6, and it's particularly nice if you're shooting at a fly target, as it's got anti-fly 3+. That isn't just aircraft anymore, it means that if you're firing at this at something like a jump pack unit, if you hit them and then you wound them on a 3+, I guess that'd be D6+2 mortal wounds, and you might slay a bunch of the squad. Seems pretty decent at its intended battlefield role, I guess now. Maybe a lot more scary against flying infantry than I would have expected. Its counterpart, the Stalker, still has those Icarus Storm Cannons. It gets 2 of them, and they both shoot 6 shots now, all hitting on 3s at strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2. I guess that means 12 shots out of this thing, and they've got anti-fly 2+, so they will be very very good at downing flyers. The slightly crazy thing that this thing gets is that it's got Skyfire protocols. If you target this thing with the Overwatch stratagem, and he gets to fire at potentially 4 different targets if they all have fly within 24 inches. It still will be hitting on 6s and everything, but just with that sort of volume of shots going every which way, you're going to take some damage on something. I think your opponent will be brave to line up too many flying targets in front of this guy. Might be a bit more of an area denial thing than an actual damage dealing threat, but still kind of fun, and goes with its fluff of firing at different targets with the storm cannons. I'm just kind of surprised at just how many shots it gets out of them though. 12 shots with autocannon profiles doesn't really seem bad, just regardless of what the tank's firing at. The Whirlwind's also seen a bit of a damage boost as well. It goes up to strength 8, AP -2, and damage 2 on the Vengeance launcher. That's the only one that it takes now, and it also has damage D6+3 shots as well, another very solid upgrade. It looks like if you actually want Space Marines that fire out of line of sight and deal hefty damage there, the Whirlwind is now actually genuinely quite good. I did feel it was a bit on the weird side when it was just flat inferior to the lone Vengor Sergeants on the Desolation Marines. Overall, that really is quite a solid damage dealing profile. Even better if you can get line of sight on it with a land speeder to spot for it with the blast keyword. Its special rule is that it helps cause battle shock on enemy units. If it hits infantry, they take a battle shock test, so you might well hand that out there. Seems rather nice to be honest. At least this thing should genuinely worry Space Marines again, as opposed to being basically ignored by almost everything that it's shot at. The Predator datasheets are still split into the Destructor and Annihilator, but at least this time there's a bit more use for that, seeing as they have different battlefield rules now. The Destructor autocannon has been tweaked a little bit. It gets a few more shots as it's got rapid fire too. 4 shots base out to 48 inches, or 6 out to 24 with strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3. Still looks fairly solid against light tanks and 3 wound infantry as well, I suppose. The Destructor's special rule is that its AP gets a bit better against infantry, so I guess perhaps it's particularly good at killing Terminators now with AP -2. I guess that's a small incentive to take the more fluffy heavy bolters paired with the autocannon. The Annihilator, on the other hand, I think I'm a bit less positive about. I feel like the turret twin las cannon should probably have got 2 shots like the Ballistas Dreadnought. Instead it's just got 1 with a twin links rule, and the twin links rule might be just a tiny bit on the redundant side, as it's going to be wounding most things on 3s anyway with that big strength of 14. Again, it is a bit incentivized to take spots on las cannons over heavy bolters, as just generically it gets to reroll damage 1 versus monsters and vehicles, and that's quite nice for those damage rolls that are a bit low. Might save you a command point reroll from time to time there. It is just a dedicated anti-tank platform really. I guess we'll see how the Predator shakes up against all the other options in the Space Marine Codex for the same role, but historically it hasn't generally tended to do very well. Otherwise, we've got the three flavours of Primaris Predator, the Gladiator, Lancer, Valiant, and Reaper. The Lancer, I'd say, is probably the most improved out of the three of them. It was a tank destroyer that just didn't really tend to do very well with its own battlefield role. I feel like that laser destroyer is now really quite a big hit. 2 shots that will often hit on a 2+ due to the heavy keyword, strength 14, AP 4, and damage d6 plus 3. Not really something that you can take lightly. And then it's got a fairly godly Aquilon Optics rule, where you get to reroll 1 hit roll, 1 wound roll, and 1 damage roll, all in the same phase. Realistically, that means that it's very, very likely to stack 2 saves on the opponent's target, and quite likely to breach armor unless they've got an invul save. Very reliable and long range, looks like it's potentially really quite efficient against armor, points pending of course. The Gladiator Reaper shares the same stat line, toughness 10, 12 wounds, and this one being the anti-infantry variant. This one mounts the twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, which has got 12 shots at strength 6, AP 0 and damage 1. This one's traded a pip of AP for devastating wounds, and it has also traded 12 shots for the twin links rule, which I think is a bit of a downgrade really. I guess at least twin links with devastating wounds gives you more chance to fish for the mortal wounds if that's the best thing to do. And it also gains sustained hits too as well if it's targeting infantry with its attacks, averaging around about 3 or 4 mortal wounds against any infantry unit if you fish for the mortals, never mind a bit of extra damage as well for regular wounds. Looks really quite threatening, and it's also got some Tempest bolters as well for another potential 16 shots if you manage to get in 12-inch range. This thing still seems to be pretty much death incarnate to enemy infantry that get too close to it. Finally, for the Gladiator tanks, we've got the Valiant as well. Its last talons on the turret have got pretty similar profiles to those Firestrike ones. They're now 36 inches, so a bit more long range, but maybe matching up a little bit less well with the multi-melters, which are now only 18. This one seems to be tasked to seek out the nearest enemy armor and destroy it. If you target the nearest enemy monster or vehicle unit, you get a +1 to hit with its guns. It does seem kind of likely to trigger that as well if it's trying to get in range with the multi-melters, which I think it usually will want to do. Next up, we've got the trusty siege machine that is the Vindicator. Toughness 11 and 11 wounds this guy with a 2+ save, really quite sturdy. It seems just to have the siege shield included at base now rather than being an optional upgrade if you want to have your Vindicator without it. The Demolisher cannon looks really quite solid, d6 plus 3 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6 with the blast keyword. That's going to be fairly scary against literally whatever it points at, whether it's an enemy land raider or an enemy infantry squad where you're getting extra hits against it. You average around about 8 wounds to something like a Space Marine Rhino, which seems like quite a good target. Its special rule is Siege Shield, which is quite fun. Basically, this one now gives it a bit of insurance against getting locked up in combat. If your enemy tags you in combat, you can still fire your blast weapon into an engagement range, though I guess you'd still be able to fire it out of combat anyway if you wanted to, provided you were happy not to fall back. As it does so as well, it can even ignore the penalty to a hit with heavy weapons in engagement range. That's rather nice. The Land Raider is definitely one of the units that was a bit more exciting out of the 10th edition reveals. This one is now able to transport things like aggressors and Primaris Marines, plus it's also got the fairly godly assault ramp keyword. This one allows you to move your Land Raider up 10 inches, get your unit out the front of it an extra 3 inches, and then that unit can still go on to charge. It means that you can have things like Terminators getting 13-inch movement and then on average a 7-inch charge, quite a good threat range for units that are usually very slow. Otherwise, no real major surprises on the datasheet. Toughness 12 and 16 wounds with a 2+ save remains sturdy. Kind of nice that the Godhammer las cannons didn't get twin linked, so they're a bit more efficient as a result. And at least the Land Raiders got the 10th edition vehicle rules now, which means that if it does get tagged in combat with things, it can fire at other things, so all your investment in the las cannons isn't wasted. Overall, just seems like a unit that's got a lot more of a point at the moment. Maybe we might see some Land Raiders paired with other units making their way onto tournament tables sometime. Otherwise, we've got the other flavours of Land Raider. The Land Raider Crusader does get a fairly terrific amount of shots with its Hurricane bolters. This gets 24 shots with them at 12-inch range and gets to re-roll the wound rolls on all of them, which does seem pretty massive. It is just going to utterly obliterate hordes. Otherwise, it's got a slightly bigger transport capacity. 16 models and things like Gravis and Terminators take up 2, Centurions and Wolfen take up 3 as standard. The twin assault cannon's quite nice as well. twin links and devastating wounds is quite a nice combo. Finally, the Land Raider Redeemer is looking all rather threatening with those Flamestorm cannons. The Flamestorm cannons get d6 plus 3 shots each now, which is truly quite terrifying. They're all at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2. Absolute barbecue time for any nearby Space Marines or most infantry in general. Again, it's got the Assault Ramp and the Twin Linked Assault Rat Cannon. Looks like a unit that's utterly terrifying on Overwatch. For the Primaris Land Raider equivalents, we've got the Repulsors. The standard one's gone up to Toughness 12, 16 wounds and a 3+ save now. Very hard to kill with anything but anti-tank weapons now. It's still got a lot of the same guns that we've seen in other places so far in the index rules, but I feel like one of the most interesting things is that they've consolidated a whole bunch of the random small arms it has into the Repulsor defensive array. This one's 24 inches and it just blasts out 18 shots at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Really quite nice that you don't have to think about every single upgrade for things like Fragstorm grenade launchers or random extra bits on the sides. You can just literally just focus all your anti-infantry units into one target and remove a little bit of decision paralysis. The Repulsor can transport 12 and can now take firstborn units including Terminators, which is fun. And it's got a rather nice special rule as well, which is called Emergency Combat Embarkation. Once per turn in the opponent's charge phase, you get to select one unit that's nearby. That unit gets to get back into the Repulsor and basically gets to escape from your opponent's wrath. Really quite a big rule and definitely some high potential for shenanigans there. Means that you could have a shooting unit get out in front of a melee army, potentially jump back into the Repulsor when they try and charge them, and then unless your opponent's got anti-tank weapons, they're not going to be doing very much to that enormous great big tank. Means that you might often have to deal with the Repulsor first, at least if you're mainly a melee army player. Otherwise, we've got the heavier gun version of the Repulsor, the Executioner. This one packs the Macroplasma or the Laser Destroyer, the Macroplasma being kind of similar to the Redemptor Dreadnought with an extra shot, the Laser Destroyer being fairly brutal with strength 16 and damage d6 plus 4 this one, even better than the Valiant's one. Otherwise, fairly similar all around, smaller transport capacity and a smaller defensive array. Its special rule is a +1 to hit enemies below half strength, so that's quite nice at finishing units off, I suppose. Might be a bit more useful for all of its small arms and other bits. I feel like you want to fire the really big guns into something where they're going to have maximal effect. Into dedicated transports now, and first up we have the Rhino. The standard firstborn battle taxi has got a transport capacity of 12. It still can't take Primaris Marines, unfortunately. The way it excludes them is via the Tacticus, Phobos and Gravis keywords, all of which are banned alongside Jump Infantry. Means that Rhinos can't transport Stern Guard as a result, I'm afraid. Otherwise though, for the units that it can transport, it's got Firing Deck 2, which means that you can have a couple of units fire out of the top hatch, which is kind of fun. Could be nice for Devastators with a couple of heavy weapons, and just in general it's going to be interesting for getting tactical marines and things to the front perhaps. You get to move up and then disembark your unit to get them in range. I suppose it could be kind of interesting for delivering Devastators with multi-melters as well. They generally want to get within 9 inches if they can now. Otherwise, it looks like you can only take the one Stormbolter now, plus or minus the very punchy strength 14 Hunter-Killer missile if you want, and its special rule is self-repairs, regenerating 1 wound at the end of each command phase to gradually regrow battle damage over the course of the game. The Razorback is basically just the Rhino with a gun on it. You still have the standard options for it, either the heavy bolters or the las cannons. The las cannon, I'd say, probably slightly disappointingly gets the Predator treatment, with strength 12 and twin linked as opposed to just flat 2 shots. It still has the assault cannon option as well, again that's the twin linked version. The Razorback doesn't get a firing deck, but it does get a rule called fire support. In your shooting phase, if the Razorback targets the same unit as the unit that got out of it did, then that enemy unit gets to reroll the wound roll against that target, really quite a nice damage buff. That one in particular seems like it might work quite well with Space Marine Devastators with multi-melters, have those strength 9 weapons reroll their wounds against the target, and you're going to be getting a whole load of crazy damage. If you want to transport around some Primaris, then we've got the Repulsor. This one can still only fit 6 units in it, not firstborn, and it can only take Tacticus or Phobos units. This one's got a firing deck of 6, so you could have, say, a whole bunch of Hellblasters firing out of it, or perhaps some Stern Guard as it drives around. They don't even need to be able to disembark to be able to shoot, though you can certainly zoom up the board with its signature move and drop a unit down onto an objective for more objective control. The top upgrade choice remains pretty flexible. Anti-Fly in the Sky Talon now of a 4+, means it's actually somewhat credible at doing a little bit of damage to flyers, I suppose. A 5+ Invor for the Shield Dome, the chance to refund command points on nearby units from the comms array, doesn't seem too bad if it's in the midst of your forces, I suppose, or just a big missile with that Bellicastus missile. Its special rule is to allow you to drop a unit after it advanced as well, so you could get out a unit really quite a long way away if you need to stretch to an objective. I guess that one will be quite nice in Devastator Doctrine, where it could still do that and not compromise on firing. The drop pod can now take Primaris Marines. It transports 10 models. Again, seems like a potentially interesting ride for Sternguard or Hellblasters to get the Alpha Strike on the opponent. And it still has the rule where you drop down on turn 1, regardless of other battlefield rules. Really quite nice for a big Alpha Strike, even in 10th edition it would seem. Again, probably pointed at a bit of a premium. I'd be surprised if it made sense to spam too many of them. Finally, for the dedicated transports, we've got the Landspeeder Storm. This one can target 6 scouts or Sergeant Talion if he is attached. It doesn't have the scouts rule innately, but it could gain it from the standard issue scout squad, I suppose, though I guess you'd only be moving 6 inches towards the enemy. It's got firing deck 6, so you can still take pot shots out of it, either with sniper rifles or shotguns or something, and its special rule is Storm Assault. This one allows you to charge after a unit's jumped out of it. Really quite good for a very, very long charge, even more so than a Land Raider maybe. If your scouts are feeling brave, then they really could take the fight to the enemy on an objective. I guess the Sergeant can pack a Thunderhammer, so I guess that wouldn't be nothing. Moving on to the Space Marine Flyers next, and first up we have the Stormhawk Interceptor. It's a toughness 9, 10 wound unit, again a little bit tankier than the Flyers were in the past with the toughness 6 or 7, but it has lost the -1 to hit now, that neither appears in the core rules nor on this Flyers datasheet. Looks like all of the book Space Marine Flyers do indeed have the hover keyword, so even with this one, as perhaps the more plain-like out of the 3, it can move around slowly at 20 inches if it wants to. I guess that's quite nice to give it the option at least of starting on the board. Otherwise, weapons-wise, the Icarus Storm Cannon looks very scary with its 6 shots. That's the same as the Stalker, and that's getting a lot more shots compared with what it was. It's anti-fly 2+ as well, so that'll be pretty savage at tearing through jump infantry. Not sure why it's listed as twin-linked on this one though. Stormhawks only have 1. Otherwise, the assault cannons have dropped a few shots but gained twin-linked with devastating wounds. The other weapons are pretty similar to other versions elsewhere in the codex, and it gets a +1 to hit against fly targets as its special rule. This thing is particularly nice at killing things out of the air, and it's not just limited to aircraft as it was in 9th. The Storm Talon's more of the ground attack plane. The profile's kind of similar, bar being toughness 8 compared with the Stormhawk's toughness 9. A little bit easier to kill with things like overcharged plasma, I guess. This one gets a +1 to hit against anything that's not fly, so hitting on a 2+ most of the time there, I suppose. Otherwise, it just hits with an awful lot of twin-linked fire. Lots of twin-linked assault cannon shots, backed up by either twin-linked heavy bolters, Skyhammer missile launchers, or a 2-shot Typhoon missile launcher. Lastly, for the Flyers, we've got the flying transport that is the Storm Raven gunship. This one's actually genuinely a fair bit tankier now. Toughness 10, so you need some heavy anti-tank to take it down. 14 wounds, and like the Redemptor Dreadnought, it's got a -1 damage rule baked in called Armored Resilience. I guess they previously had that rule where they weren't so easy to kill with melter weapons. I think it is kind of nice to have these a little bit harder to kill. They often tend to get shot down a bit depressingly easily these days. The Storm Raven's got a transport capacity of 12. It can take both Primaris and Centurions, and it can also transport a Dreadnought along from the ride, slung along under the back. It's going to be so much more relevant as a transport now that you can actually get out of it after it's moved. It means that you can actually make use of its good movement characteristic, jump out your squads and things, and take the fight to the enemy. You wouldn't be able to charge, but even just getting them in a good position and lighting them up with a bunch of shots I think is enough to justify it. The threat range really would be quite big with a 20-inch movement. I think you probably usually want to start it on the board in hover mode, as coming in turn 2 and then only dropping things turn 3 seems a bit late. People were wondering whether or not it might get the assault ramp special rule as well, seeing as it basically does have one, but it seems that they've chosen not to. Might be for the best given that it moves quite so quickly. Space Marines just have the one fortification, and it's the Hammer 4 bunker. It looks like 10th edition has seen a reinterpretation of its fires against everything rules with the Hammer 4 heavy bolter array. The Hammer 4 bunker really is quite tough, a big toughness 12, a 2+ save and 14 wounds. Not really a profile that most armies are going to want to like to slog through if they have a choice, but it does look like if this one's in the right place it could cause problems. Its attacks are made with the big missile launcher, super frag or super cracked rockets with 2 shots, but probably the most interesting thing is the Hammer 4 heavy bolter array, shooting out to 36 inches with 6 attacks hitting on 4s, strength 5, AP -1, damage 2, sustained hits 1, and twin links. By far the most interesting thing though is that it also gets a rule called defensive array. which basically means that the Hammerfall bunker gets to shoot at an enemy unit every time it moves, advances, or falls back within range of this weapon. You just casually get to shoot that unit as if it were your shooting phase, and you can do so up to 4 times in the enemy turn if they keep on moving around in front of your bunker. This really does seem pretty brutal for any armies that don't have all that much durability to me. Even with ballistic skill 4+, you're still landing an average of 4 hits on the foe due to sustained hits, and then those heavy bolter hits will re-roll the wound roll as well, so you should at least trigger some saves. Might well kill a space marine or two on average, or do a bit worse to things like lighter hordes. Seems fairly brutal. I think that the heavy bolters would definitely be the way to go. Will be interesting to see whether or not they go back to pointing it at a massive premium again. Otherwise, it's got a few supporting fortification type rules. It's got Ceramite cover, which kind of makes it into a terrain feature to give other things that are partially obscured by it the benefit of cover. Kind of similar to how ruins work, really. And also it's got some fortification rules as well for enemy units that are engaged with it, kind of similar to Big Guns Never Tire, but not really. If I'm reading it right, it sounds like enemy units that charge this thing would actually shut up its firepower, and that it can't fire out of combat. They also say that enemy units don't need to take desperate escape checks to fall back when they're battle shocked as well. I guess the bunker isn't going to move around and try and run them down. I guess it might still shoot them a bit. Depending on lines of sight and how much terrain you're playing with, this does look kind of interesting to me. The damage output looks meaningful enough to actually scare quite a lot of enemy units now, even if it's not going to take too much damage off big heavy things. Finally, we come to the many flavours of Space Marine character, and we'll start off with the captains and the HQ type choices from 9th edition. In 10th, the characters are generally leaders that all lead squads of similar sort of armour variants to them, so the Primaris ones generally tend to lead the Tacticus type units. For this guy, it's the Assault Intercessors, the Infernus squad, Hellblasters, Blade Guard, Intercessors, and Stern Guard veterans. Weirdly, he's got some equipment restrictions that lock him to certain loadouts if he wants to join some units. He needs to take the Indomitor's Blade Guard type loadout with the Relic Shield and things if he wants to join a Blade Guard squad, and weirdly he needs to pick up a Plasma Pistol if he wants to lead Hellblasters. I guess otherwise, unless he's packing the Plasma himself, they just won't respect him. The Space Marine captains come with that pretty excellent special rule to have a 0 command point stratagem for the unit that they're leading each battle round. You can only use one copy of this rule each battle round regardless of having more of them, so it really has a good incentive to have at least one captain somewhere in your army, but not more than one. I guess ideally you'd want him leading the biggest threatening unit around, something that you're going to spend CP on turn. Otherwise his stat line maybe isn't too surprising. 5 wounds rather than 6, and he still has his 4+ invul save. Solid enough combat weapons with Power Fists and the Mastercrafted Power Weapon on offer. His Relic Shield maybe isn't quite as meaningful, just giving him 1 extra wound, as opposed to saves against mortals or extra armor. Finally, his special rule is called Finest Hour. He gets a single-use Rage mode once per game where he gets to hit very hard in combat, an extra 3 attacks and devastating wounds for one phase. Genuinely looks like a fair force to be reckoned with there that could take out entire squads of enemies, particularly with a Power Fist. He'll definitely add a bit of raw melee power to the unit. Otherwise, rattling through the other captains, we've got the Gravis captain, which has taken in the heavy bolt rifle version into this. They can lead the aggressors, eradicators, or heavy intercessors, still have the 0 CP stratagem thing and toughness 6 Gravis armor now, and it looks like his Gravis armor fighting styles have been realised by the extra attack rule. You get more extra attacks with your chainsword, and then a few less if you take the fist or the relic blades for your extra hits. I feel like perhaps the relic blade seems like the most useful out of the 3, paired with his regular power fist. His other special rule is that he halves damage allocated to him, so he's extra tanky, and I suppose could get even more so if you gave him Artificer armor as well. Next up, we've got the captain in Phobos armor. They can lead any of the Phobos units, plus also interestingly Scout squads or Scout sniper squads. I genuinely do wonder if they're going to be getting a more Primaris style resculpt at some stage. He doesn't really do a huge amount of damage himself. He's just got a single shot with the Instigator Bolt Carbine at AP 2 and damage 2. He does have the Infiltrators and Stealth keywords though, so he can join these units as they move forward towards the enemy. His stratagem rule looks like the main thing that you bring him in from, but he also has a rather nice Master of Deceit special rule as well, which is one of those redeployment type ones. This one triggers after you know first turn, and you get to redeploy a bunch of either Phobos or Scout units and put them somewhere safe. I guess you could either play more aggressively if you know you've got first turn, or hide them a bit if you know that you're going second. Next up, we've got the captain in Terminator armor from the Leviathan box. He can lead Relic Terminators, Assault Squads, or Terminator Squads as you'd expect. Rather than just being locked to one loadout like the Leviathan box one, he's got really quite a lot of weapons, probably implying that a more flexible kit option is coming somewhere down the line. He's got the choice of most of the Space Marine arsenal with melee weapons. A lot of them are actually surprisingly similar in terms of damage output against various targets, maybe the Power Fist and Thunderhammer just edging slightly ahead compared with the field. Otherwise, he's got a choice of a Combi or a Stormbolter, the Rites of Battle for cheaper stratagems on Terminators as a very scary threatening unit, and his special rule is the Imperium Sword, allowing you to reroll charge rolls made for the unit, really quite a big deal and often something that eats command points if you fail. Then we've got the Firstborn flavour captains. Your standard issue captain has got a very flexible choice of war gear. They can lead assault squads, command squads, tactical squads, vanguard veteran squads, but apparently not Sternguard now. He can also only lead the ones on foot, not the jump pack ones. Otherwise, kind of similar to the Primaris captain, really. A very solid choice of range and melee weapons, and a similar number of attacks. Again, he has the finest hour special rule, again hitting with an extra 3 attacks and devastating wounds. The captain with the jump pack is still a thing, fortunately. Again, it might have been one of the ones that's a tiny bit at risk, seeing as Games Workshop doesn't sell one single model like that. He'll attach to either the assault squads, or in my opinion, the heavily nerfed Vanguard veteran squads now. Again, pretty crazily flexible gear, just like the regular one, where he swaps out the Rage Mode single-use fight phase for a +1 to the strength of the unit's weapons when he's making a charge. It doesn't go quite as far as it might have done in 9th edition maybe, but it's still kind of helpful for skirmishing with infantry. I guess that's Strength 6 Vanguard veterans or Strength 5 Assault Marines, plus a small boost to their more fancy melee attacks. Lastly, for the captains, it seems like the captain on bike is still a thing. Kind of interesting that he's represented by a conversion there in the picture. That's the old captain kit with a standard biker. He can only lead bike squads and outrider squads now. Definitely a bit more limited in scope than he was before, when he could run around being very fast and also screened. His main boost, besides the melee and the stratagem thing, is a rule called Swift Assault. He gives his units the assault keyword on their weapons. Really quite nice for the special weapons of the regular bite squad in particular, I think. They definitely want to be turbo boosting around the board to get close, and that could allow them 18-inch movement, then light up the enemy with a bunch of melter guns maybe. Would be really quite nice in the assault doctrine that 18-inch move, shoot your guns, and then charge with a captain's melee profile thrown in. Next up, we come to the many flavours of Primaris Lieutenants. The standard one can lead all the Tacticus armoured squads, and he's got the special rule saying that he can join if either a captain or a chapter master is attached as well. The lieutenants are perhaps a bit more into the actual standard damage dealing buffs, at least compared with the captain's stratagem shenanigans. He gives the unit lethal hits, which is quite nice for any of the lower strength units in particular. To be honest, it's quite good on just about any of them, even Hellblasters will quite like it to punch up against tanks. It also allows the units to fall back, shoot and charge as well, very rarely a bad thing to have even if it doesn't come up all the time, basically tactical doctrine built in. The Reaver Lieutenant doesn't have a particularly massive amount of damage, but at least his attacks get precision I suppose. Could help out with a Reaver squad with a little bit more quality precision attacks there. He also gives the unit lethal hits for punching up with those lower strength attacks, and pushes out their Terror Troops aura out to another 3 inches. I guess that'd be -1 leadership out to 9 inches, maybe not the worst thing in the world in the age of battle shock. Still seems like a bit of a tough sell to me without doing much damage. The Phobos Armoured Lieutenant gives his lethal hits to either Incursors, Infiltrators or Reavers, and his other buff is to allow the units to make a normal move of d6 inches after they've shot. Move, shoot, move for these guys. Again, really quite a helpful thing to have them moving towards the midboard maybe, or pinging in and out of cover, taking some shots while staying somewhat safe. Seems handy enough, though whether or not it's actually worth the cost of including him is perhaps another thing. He'd still have to be pretty cheap to make himself worth it, I think. Interestingly enough, the Combi Weapon Lieutenant from the Leviathan box set has some very fun rules compared with just about any of the other HQ choices. He gets to be kind of like a mini Space Marine assassin with a feel no pain of 5+, infiltrators and lone operative to stop him getting shot too easily. Really quite tanky and also a massively powerful reactive movement mechanic, allowing him to make a normal move if the enemy finishes within 9 inches, potentially just backpedaling straight out of lone operative range so he can't be shot. His damage isn't really particularly exciting though. He has a combi weapon for some mortal wounds against infantry I guess, plus paired combat blades for a bunch of strength 4 AP 0. It does have the fun anti-tyrannid 4+ word though. Seems like the main thing that he actually does for the rest of the army is a damage buff against units that are trying to take one objective. He gets to designate one objective as a priority target, and then any of your starties within 6 inches of him get to reroll wound rolls of 1 versus enemies there. It's not bad, and it could affect some really quite big guns, but it might have some overlap with Oath of Moments from time to time, plus it's not exactly very flexible as it can only target the units that are on that point. Really quite a lot of cool utility rules I think, but it doesn't really feel like it does a lot. Finally, we've got the Firstborn Lieutenant, far more flexible gear than any of the rest of them, and it does look like he can take a Storm Shield unrestricted now, which is quite nice if you want the 4+ invul to keep him just that little bit safer. Pretty much the same as the Primaris one though, lethal hits and fallback shoot and charge. To be honest though, I can't imagine that the units that he can lead are particularly excited to having him lead them though. If he could join Devastators or something, that would be a bit more exciting. Space Marine Psychers with the Librarians next, and first up the Primaris Librarian on foot can basically join most of the Tacticus armoured stuff. He deals a little bit of damage with his dual mode smite power, having a bit of a chance to take some mortal wounds with Hazardous if he goes for the big mode, and can add a little bit of melee power with his force weapon. His big rules though are really adding a ton of durability to the unit. He gives the squad that he joins a 4+ invulnerable save, which seems quite nice on things like Hellblasters perhaps. Plus he also gives units a 4+ feel no pain against psychic attacks as well, which for some armies are going to be quite a big thing. He is pretty much just a flat durability include though. It's not really going to be doing all that much dangerous in himself. I guess we'll see if he does enough to justify his cost of the 4+ invul save for these fairly dangerous units. The Phobos Librarian is perhaps kind of interesting to add a little bit of threat to your Phobos units. His smite is actually a fair bit more dangerous than a few of the unit's weapons, as it is force weapon, so it could be helpful for helping them handle elites. Otherwise though, he gives the unit the same 4+ feel no pain ability against psychic attacks with the psychic hood, and his special rule is shrouding. He gives the unit a -1 to hit with stealth, and also gives them sort of like the lone operative keyword really. The Phobos squad that he joins can't be shot unless it's within 12-inch range of the enemy. Really quite a nice rule to give to them, but again whether or not it's worth the price of inclusion for the Librarian might be a bit questionable. I feel like the defensive rules sort of want a squad to keep away from the foe, whereas his combat and smite wants him to go towards them. The Librarians also get a datasheet with the jump pack separated out. The jump pack Librarian can lead an assault squad or a Vanguard veteran squad, and it is kind of interesting as he gains access to a different psychic power. He gets Mites of Heroes, which buffs the squad with an extra AP to their melee weapons. That does seem pretty decent for both the Vanguard veterans and the assault squad. Get that AP -1 up to AP -2 and you're a lot more threatening. Plus again he'll be able to add a little bit of melee power on his own with his strength 6 and I guess AP -2 force weapon on this build. He does lack the big 4+ invul save though, that's the selling point of his on foot peers. Finally, we've got the great big jazzy Librarian with the power axe from Leviathan. He's got smite, and his psychic power is the Veil of Time, giving the Terminator unit that he's leading sustained hits 1. I guess with a leader character for a Terminator unit, you've either got the captain to give them discounted stratagems and reroll charges, or this guy's some defense against psychic attacks, and also just a flat damage boost to all their guns and weapons. Looks like you can't both attach the Terminator Librarian and the Terminator Captain to the unit, so you need to choose one or the other. Finally, we've got the standard Firstborn on foot Librarian. He basically does the same as the regular Primaris one. He joins the Firstborn foot squads, but again can't join Devastators I'm afraid, and he gives the 4+ invul to either Assault Marines, Command Squads, Tactical Squads, or Vanguard Veterans. Chaplains next, and these bastions of Space Marine faith often seem to help out with wound rolls in combat or battle shock in the new edition. The Primaris Chaplain can once again join most of the things with Tacticus style armour, including things like Blade Guard. It's a leadership of 5+, so he does make any unit that he joins a bit less battle shock susceptible, even more so than things like Captains. His special rules give you the Litany of Hate, which is a +1 to the wound roll in melee. Really quite nice, and that looks particularly nice for Blade Guard veterans with a sort of middling strength 5 attacks. Also having one in your formation can help ward against battle shock a bit. Once per battle he just gets to turn off a crucial battle shock roll within 12 inches. Could be a good one to stop you losing some victory points at a key moment there. Generally being a mainly melee thing though, I think he's usually going to want to join the Blade Guard or the Assault Intercessors rather than the others. Next up, it seems like the Terminator Chaplain is still surviving despite not having an on-sale model. He unsurprisingly leads Terminator squads, and he gets the same +1 to wound with Litany of Hate, which does look really good on Power Fist to be fair. I guess it's a bit of a competition between him and the Librarian. The Librarian buffs both range and combat a little bit. This guy gives a really quite big boost to combat, and he also has a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds rather than psychic attacks, so that is also quite nice for Terminators, as that's one of the better ways to damage them. Overall, looks pretty decent for Terminators, though I feel like the choice between him and the Librarian is probably going to go one way or the other depending on points and things. The Chaplain on bike can either release bike squads or outriders, quite nice that he's not locked to Primaris only as well. Again, he's got the +1 to wound, which I think will be relevant on both of them with the mass strength 4 attacks, and he also allows devastating wounds with shooting as well against one unit within 12 inches. That seems nice enough with either profile, I suppose, perhaps particularly if it's the Oath of Moment target, so you can reroll all the wound rolls to get some more 6s. It potentially could be hitting very hard if you get lucky with a cheeky melter gun or something. Both pretty strong buffs. I feel like he could be an interesting enough choice if you had a really massed up unit, perhaps 6 of them and either an attack bike or an ATV. The on foot chaplain doesn't really have anything major going on compared with the Primaris one. Again, it's just leading the on foot firstborn like the Vanguard veterans or the assault squad. And like with the Librarian, you've also got the option for a jump pack one as well to lead your assault squad and Vanguard veterans through the sky. Again, a +1 to wound roll is pretty excellent with those guys, really quite nice on lower strength weapons, and his bonus special rule doubles down on mortal wound impact hits, a chance for D3 mortal wounds on a 4+, or a flat 3 on a 6. I guess that's kind of nice in combination with, say, the assault squad's Hammer of Wrath there. Could be a fairly brutal amount of mortal wounds slamming into the enemy if he rolls well alongside them. Next up, we've got some Tech Marines to fix your machines. The Tech Marine's actually got quite a lot of deployment options. He can either lead Assault Intercessors, regular Intercessors, or an Servitors unit, or he can just be a lone operative by himself. He gets that if he's nearby to vehicles, so that means that he could support tank armies solo. His two buffing rules have kind of been combined. It heals D3 wounds and a +1 to hit for one vehicle at the same time. You can't now target them on two different things, unfortunately. Still pretty solid though, and I think that will be quite tempting on big units with a whole load of guns covered all over them. Shooty Dreadnoughts, Repulsors or Land Raiders maybe come to mind. He does need to be near to there in the command phase though, so you kind of need to set that up the turn before. I do quite like the way that he goes into rage mode as well if a vehicle is killed near him. If an enemy vehicle is destroyed within 12 inches, then he goes up to an attack characteristic of 7 with his Omniscient Power Axe, so that's 7 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2, potentially a threat to entire squads of medium infantry there. That is kind of funny as a consolation prize if his vehicle does get blown up, and then he just needs to take the fight to the enemy. The firstborn Tech Marine is still here with his servo harness as well. He's only got the option of a tactical squad or servitors, which is going to limit him a bit more. He might be falling back on the lone operative a bit, I suppose. In general, he just remains a very flexible datasheet, options for things like Power Fists or Thunder Hammers, and basically just is the same sort of things as the Primaris Tech Marine with the healing plus the rage mode after the vehicle dies, but with slightly different kit with the servo harness rather than the Forged Bolter and Graph Pistol. Next up, we've got a couple of Apothecaries. The Primaris Apothecary is not part of a command squad, so he can lead any of the Tacticus armoured squads. Perhaps particularly nice for anything that's quite valuable, like maybe Hellblasters and the Stern Guard. His special rule is basically the combat restorative stratagem built in. He doesn't give a feel no pain type rule anymore, but he basically just sets up a slain model at the start of the command phase, so you get to replenish your unit slightly. It does kind of bank on the unit not being entirely wiped out though. I feel like he really would want to use this on 3 wound models like Blade Guard, but Blade Guard or anything tougher like Gravis or Terminators aren't on his list of things he can join. Otherwise, he's got a Thumb Reductor pistol for a very high AP damage 2 shot if you get very close. And interestingly enough, he's doing a little bit of Gene Seed recovery if all of his Blastal brothers do get shot to death. When his bodyguard unit is killed, he gets a command point on the roll of a 2+. I guess that's a bit of a consolation prize if all your friends are dead. The Apothecary Biologist kind of isn't really an apothecary, the new boy from the Leviathan box set in Gravis armor. This guy can join Aggressors, Eradicators or Heavy Intercessors, and again he's one of the ones who can join with a Captain or Chapter Master, though we don't have many details as to what a Chapter Master does yet. He kind of functions like an objective-taking lieutenant. He gives the squad lethal hits, which to be honest all of them enjoy, perhaps particularly Aggressors with a whole load of medium strength attacks. A few more auto wounds is pretty nice. As well as that, he also has Objective Control 3 base, and if his unit happens to kill an enemy unit in combat, then he gets to take some scientific samples and go up to an Objective Control 9. pretty much your objective a lot of the time, unless this guy actually dies. Kind of a shame that he doesn't have any healing abilities whatsoever built in. Games Workshop did say that he was a bit more of a battlefield scientist than anything else, though it might have been kind of nice to still have something like a Feel No Pain or a restored model. Next up, the various flavours of Ancient now give you objective control. The Primaris one can join the Tacticus armoured things besides Blade Guard. I guess that's often raising the troops from Objective Control to Objective Control 3, or the Elites to Objective Control 2. He's also got a fun and fluffy special rule where he gets a 4+ Feel No Pain if he's planting a flag within the centre of the board. I guess that's nice enough for him, but I suppose if he's getting attacked, then the rest of his units are dead, and the main thing that he's doing isn't happening anymore. Overall, I think it's kind of fun to have more objective control, but it would have to be really quite a cheap unit upgrade to bother bringing him just compared with more damage dealers that still put more points on the objective. The Blade Guard Ancient is perhaps a little bit more exciting. I guess Blade Guard being a tough unit with storm shields and things are a sort of unit that might be scrapping over objectives. Having more points on that could be nice. Plus he also gives the Blade Guard +1 attack once per game, which is kind of good for their combat boost. Unlike the Primaris one though, he doesn't have the option of having a decent combat weapon himself, so he's just kind of watching, cheering on for the most part. The Terminator Ancient can lead all of the Terminator flavour squads, and again can join if a captain's there. He's a bit more threatening than the Blade Guard Ancient, having access to things like Power Fists or Thunderhammers. Again, I feel like he could actually be a pretty interesting choice to attach to a Terminator unit. Again, a squad that's going to be fighting over objectives and in the thick of the fray. He also gives them a damage boost when the unit's injured at all, a +1 to hit when they're below their starting strength, and a +1 to wound when they're below half strength. I feel like that's kind of possible with how tanky the units are. They might get attacks but not get wiped. Next up, for a new datasheet added to the Space Marines, we've got the Primaris Company Champion. Looks like it's finally a proper part of the Codex, or at least the Index, despite having a special release model and then not having that followed up besides for a made-to-order run. He can join a bunch of the Tacticus armoured stuff, though not all of them, Assault Intercessors, Blade Guard, Infernus Squads, Intercessors, or Stern Guard Squads, perhaps generally slightly more aggressive melee units than most. He brings a few things, a bunch of quality melee attacks hitting at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2, they have precision for sniping characters out of units, and just to make sure that he's really good at that, he also gets to re-roll the hit rolls and wound rolls if he's targeting characters. He also gives the unit a +1 to advance and charge, which seems very good for Blade Guard, plus a 0 CP heroic intervention stratagem as well, which I guess might be kind of useful to threaten his unit with a lot of melee power, protecting something that doesn't have quite so much. Looks usable provided he's at least fairly cheap. He's not adding too much besides being a melee brawler, though the advance and charge thing is handy. Finally, last but by no means least, for the generic Space Marine units, we have the Judas here, a spooky chaplain-themed Space Marine with an Executioner Greatblade to take the heads of the enemy. He attacks with 5 attacks with that, a Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2, a very nice generalist profile that could actually threaten tanks. He also gets devastating wounds and precision as well for mortal wounds on 6s and hitting characters. His big buff is that he gives a unit fight first. That means that if the enemy charges them, then you get to hit them before they get to hit you most of the time, so that's really quite a nice buff, and again is very good on something that's very fighty. I guess out of this list again, it's going to be Blade Guard, maybe Assault Intercessors perhaps. He also has a slightly fun and fluffy special rule where if he kills a character with the Great Blade, it gets an extra attack. Probably not really quite that much of a meaningful buff, given how hard it is to unlock though. He also gets a 4+ Imball save in melee only as well, so that's kind of nice for keeping him a little bit more survivable there. Seems like he could be useful, again looks like one of the units that could buff the Blade Guard pretty well. So anyway, there we have it, a bit of a run through just about every unit in Index Space Marines. Really quite a mammoth download that one, and a whole load of very strong power armoured goodness. Overall, I feel like Space Marines more than just about any army in the game are going to have the right tools for the job. Lots of powerful datasheet abilities that seem like they could work together with some pretty good synergy. I feel like things like the Incursors +1 to hit with the Storm Speeder's extra AP on a target could lead to some rather brutal focused fire, and I've got quite a lot of powerful gunline units to back it up with. The Gladius formation seems really nice, I do like the stratagems for it. I feel like they've been really quite nicely thought through in combination with the combat doctrines, and I feel like between that and Oath of Moment, they're going to get the feel of Space Marines moving very fast and hitting very hard. As mentioned, I'll be aiming to follow up this review with a review of all the unique chapter special characters, so look out for that later, might be Sunday. I'm sure we'll have plenty more indexes to talk through next week. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics or check back later if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to help support the channel and keep all these videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Making all these videos does take a pretty enormous amount of time and effort, particularly great big massive 2-hour ones like this, and if you have got some good value out of it, any support on the Patreon is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.